The mist hangs low over the water, so still that it seems to hold its breath. Dawn has not yet broken, but the sky is beginning to glow with a faint blue shimmer, the kind that makes the world feel suspended between night and day. A lone traveler stands at the edge of the lake, bundled against the cold, listening to the soft rustle of pines swaying in a wind too gentle to feel. The air carries a scent of earth and cedar, ancient and clean, as if untouched for centuries. This place feels old. Older than maps, older than stories, older than the bones of the land itself. And yet something here stirs. A whisper, a presence, a memory waiting for a voice. The traveler has come seeking answers, guided not by modern science or tourism brochures, but by a rumor, a legend passed from one person to another, fading and returning like the tide. Somewhere in this vast northern wilderness, it is said that a prophecy once echoed through the trees. A warning carved into time, carried through generations by voices who understood the world long before settlers drew borders across it. A prophecy called the Seven Fires. It speaks not only of ancient migrations or tribal histories, but of a destiny shared by everyone who now lives on this continent, native and non-native alike. The traveler kneels by the water and touches the surface with trembling fingers. The lake barely ripples. There is a sense that the land itself is listening, watching, waiting for someone to remember. The old stories speak of a path taken by the ancestors, a long journey guided by visions, dreams, and signs. Each stage of that journey was marked by a fire, not a literal flame but a spiritual era, an age defined by awakening, danger, or change. And in the heart of these teachings lies a final choice, one that has not yet been made. A choice that will determine the fate of the world to come. But these teachings were never meant to be read like scripture locked behind glass. They lived in words spoken around campfires, in songs whispered to children, in ceremonies held under starlit skies. They survived not because they were written down, but because they were carried through memory, defended across centuries of struggle. Yet now, in a time when forests burn, waters rise, and the earth trembles beneath the weight of modern ambition, the prophecy has taken on new meaning. Too many details align. Too many warnings echo through today's headlines. The traveler feels a strange pull, as if the land itself is inviting a deeper question. What if the old prophets were not merely speaking for their people, but for an entire future they knew they'd never see? What if their visions were glimpses of an age thousands of years ahead, describing events they could only understand symbolically, like strangers arriving from the sea, the land growing sick, or a time when people forget who they are? A distant call of a loon breaks the silence, haunting and pure. The traveler closes their eyes. Images flash behind their eyelids. Canoes gliding across misty waters, fires burning in encircled lodges, elders raising their voices to the night sky. The traveler does not know these images, yet they feel familiar, as if inherited through some forgotten connection. It is said that the Seven Fires prophecy does not belong to any one nation but to all who walk this land. It speaks of unity, of survival, of understanding the sacred relationship between human beings and the earth that sustains them. But it also speaks of betrayal, destruction, and an almost complete collapse, events that came true with chilling accuracy during the centuries of colonization. Still, the prophecy insists that all is not lost. There is one age left, one fire yet to burn. The traveler rises slowly. The horizon flares orange as the sun finally begins to ascend, illuminating the lake in shimmering gold. Shadows retreat from the shore, revealing the full landscape, towering pines, rocky outcrops, the faint path leading deeper into the forest. The world seems to awaken with the light, yet something in the air remains heavy with mystery. It feels like standing inside a story that hasn't finished telling itself. Somewhere beyond the trees lies the trail of the ancestors, the path the Anishinaabe followed for generations as they migrated across vast distances in search of a prophesied homeland. They were told they would know the place by the sign of a turtle, by water stretching to the horizon, by the presence of a life-giving plant. These clues, thousands of years old, guided entire nations. And now, modern historians and archaeologists are just beginning to understand how accurate some of these directions may have been. But facts alone cannot capture the spirit of the journey, the reason behind it, or the weight of the prophecy that shaped it. The traveler takes a deep breath. The cold bites at their skin, but beneath it is an undeniable thrill, a tension between fear and fascination. Standing here on the edge of this lake, it becomes clear why people still seek the prophecy, why it refuses to be forgotten. The 7 fires do not offer simple explanations. They reveal a pattern, a rhythm in history that stretches further than modern civilization usually dares to look. They ask impossible questions. How did ancient prophets foresee events centuries ahead? Were these predictions metaphorical, intuitive, or something far more mysterious? And if they foresaw the past so clearly, what does that mean for the future still unfolding? The sun climbs higher, turning the mist into threads of silver, drifting across the lake like spirits returning to the sky. The traveler steps away from the shore and toward the forest path. Somewhere deeper in the wilderness lies the beginning of the story, a story of vision, warning, and hope, carried like embers through time. A story that may reveal not only where the first fire was lit, but why its final flame now rests in our hands. The traveler pauses at the tree-line, feeling the weight of what waits ahead. The prophecy speaks of 7 ages, but it also speaks of a final choice. A moment when people must decide between harmony and destruction, between remembering and forgetting, between lighting the next fire or letting the last ember fade into darkness. The wind stirs again, gentle but purposeful, and the whisper returns, soft, ancient, insistent. 7 fires, 7 eras, 1 last decision. And with that realization trembling in their chest, the traveler steps into the forest, following a path that leads not only into the past, but toward a future still undecided. The story begins long before written records, long before borders, long before Europe ever imagined a world across the ocean. It begins with a people who understood the land not as property, but as a living relative, one that spoke, warned, guided, and remembered. Among these peoples were the Anishinaabe, whose stories root them deep into the ancient fabric of North America. To understand the prophecy of the 7 fires, one must first understand the world that shaped it and the minds that carried it forward through hundreds of generations. In those early ages, the land was a vast, breathing tapestry of forests, rivers, and endless lakes that mirrored the sky. Life moved in cycles, and knowledge passed through stories rather than ink. Elders carried entire libraries in their memories, cosmologies, histories, migrations, scientific understandings of plants, animals, and seasons. Every story had layers. One for children, one for adults, and one that only revealed itself after years of listening. The 7 Fires prophecy was one such story, a sacred vessel of meaning that unfolded slowly, like a dawn warming across the horizon. People did not speak of the prophecy as a myth. Myths were merely stories of entertainment. This was something else entirely. It was presented as a teaching, a roadmap, a mirror for future generations. The Anishinaabe believed that time was not linear but circular, and the prophecy reflected that worldview. Each fire represented not a single event but an era, a spiritual age burning with its own lessons, dangers, and transformations. Every generation added interpretation, shaped by their own challenges and triumphs. Around evening campfires, when the night animals stirred and the stars emerged one by one, children would sit close to their elders, watching sparks rise like tiny spirits and vanish into the sky. It was in moments like these that the prophecy was spoken. Its words were rhythmic, almost ceremonial, carrying the weight of untold years. The language itself, the lilting, melodic Anishinaabe, held meanings layered like petals. A single phrase could contain history, guidance, caution, and hope all at once. The prophecy began by describing a great journey that the people must one day undertake. A journey westward, toward a place where their identity, survival, and destiny would be intertwined. But these were not mere geographical instructions. They were spiritual imperatives. The ancestors believed that the Creator, or the Great Mystery, communicated through dreams and visions. The first prophet, whose identity is now wrapped in legend, received a message that the people had strayed from certain teachings and needed to seek a new center of balance. This vision formed the first fire, the beginning of the long migration. Yet before the journey began, the people lived harmoniously across a wide region of the Northeast. Places we now call the St. Lawrence River Valley, the maritime forests, and the great woodlands stretching toward the Atlantic. Their societies were complex, with political councils, clan systems, and spiritual roles that worked together like organs of one body. Every clan had responsibilities. The Crane and Loon clans for leadership, the Bear clan for protection and healing, the Fish clan for teaching, and others with roles just as vital. In this cultural ecosystem, teachings like the Seven Fires were not abstract spirituality but foundations of community, behavior, and identity. The more one listens to the prophecy, the clearer it becomes that it is not simply historical. It reflects a profound understanding of human nature. Conflict, curiosity, greed, generosity, forgetfulness, resilience. It anticipates trouble not as divine punishment but as consequence. It warns of moments when the people would weaken from within, divided by fear or temptation. It also foretells periods of unity, when shared purpose would rekindle strength like a flame sheltered from the wind. Scholars who encounter the prophecy today are often struck by its structure. It unfolds like a narrative arc, beginning with movement and change, descending into darkness, then rising again toward renewal. But within indigenous storytelling traditions, such structure is not crafted for dramatic effect. It is shaped by the cycles of nature, the rise and fall of seasons, the death and rebirth of forests, the ebbs and flows of rivers. In this natural rhythm, the seven fires are not just 7 time periods. They are the heartbeat of a people. The Anishinaabe did not speak of destiny as fixed. The prophecy was not a prediction carved in stone. It was a set of possibilities. At every fire, the people faced choices. Some choices strengthened the community. Others led to suffering. This flexibility respected human free will, acknowledging that the future was not guaranteed. Even the final fire, the 7th fire, describes 2 potential paths, one healing, one destructive, depending on the decisions made by all who now inhabit the land. The early fires emphasized teachings: how to live with humility, how to maintain balance, how to recognize signs when they appear. In many oral versions, the prophets describe metaphors that would later seem eerily literal: warnings of strangers with faces like light, objects that float across the water, roads of iron, and a time when the earth grows weary of the way humans treat it. For centuries, these images were understood symbolically. Only after contact with Europeans did people begin to recognize the jarring precision in these ancient visions. Before that turning point, long before Europeans arrived, the prophecy functioned almost like a compass. It told the people when to move, when to gather, when to prepare themselves for difficult transitions. The early fires described not only external journeys but internal ones: how communities must stay united, how certain ceremonies must be preserved, and how forgetting one's teachings could leave people vulnerable to confusion or manipulation. When the elders recited these teachings, there was always a moment, a pause, where the fire crackled and the night pressed in close. In that silence, listeners could feel the magnitude of what they were hearing. They were being entrusted with the memory of their ancestors and the responsibility of carrying that memory forward. It was said that a teaching only lives as long as someone remembers it. In this way, every generation became a link in a chain stretching back into prehistory. As the ancient world shifted and populations moved, the prophecy traveled with them, adapting but never changing its core message. It reminded people that history does not move aimlessly. Every event, every season, every struggle is part of a greater conversation between humanity and the land. The first fire, which would set the Great Migration into motion, was not only a directive. It was a promise that the people had a purpose larger than survival. And so, before the migration began, before ships appeared on the horizon, before treaties were written or broken, the people were already living inside a prophecy. They had already heard a warning about the world to come. They had already been told that the choices they made would matter not just for themselves, but for all who came after. The dawn of the first fire was approaching, and with it, the beginning of a journey that would reshape a continent. The people were preparing to step into an age that would define their identity, forge their alliances, test their endurance, and eventually place them face to face with the greatest upheaval they had ever known. But in these early times, as the teachings spread from lodge to lodge, the prophecy was still something fragile, something sacred, something only the elders fully grasped. The whispers of the 7 fires had begun, echoing softly across forests and rivers, waiting for the moment when the first flame would be lit, and the great migration west would change everything. The journey west did not begin with a battle cry, a ceremony, or a grand declaration. It began quietly, like ripples spreading across a still lake. One village packed their lodges, then another, then entire clans began to move. No one could quite explain why the time felt right, only that the signs the prophets spoke of were aligning. The elders said the people must follow the path shown in visions. A long westward migration that would take them through forests, along rivers, across lakes, and into lands none of them had ever seen. This was the 3rd fire in motion, the fulfillment of a destiny foretold long before anyone living had been born. In those days, the world itself seemed immense. The dense eastern woodlands were a maze of rivers and ancient trees, their roots twisting like veins beneath the soil. Traveling through such terrain was no small feat. Families carried what they could: bundles of hides, tools of copper and stone, dried food for the journey. Canoes glided along winding waterways, their surfaces etched with clan symbols that told the story of who traveled within them. Every movement was deliberate, grounded in knowledge passed down over millennia. How to navigate by the stars, how to read the currents, how to predict weather from the scent of the wind. The people were searching for a sign described by the first prophet. He had spoken of a place where a certain food would grow, a plant called the menumen, the wild rice, the food that grows on water. They were told this plant would guide them to the land meant to sustain them for generations. But as the migration stretched on for years, then decades, and eventually centuries, the people began to wonder if they had misunderstood the prophecy. They traveled through territories rich with game, berries, and fish, yet the sacred plant was nowhere to be found. Despite the uncertainty, the journey continued. The migration was not one long march but a series of movements shaped by seasons, wars, alliances, and the pressures of neighboring nations. Some groups traveled ahead, scouting new regions. Others remained behind, building temporary settlements where they could hunt, farm, and raise children until the next movement began. Every time they settled, they reminded themselves, this is not the final place. The sign has not yet appeared. Along the way, their culture transformed. Ceremonies evolved, new songs emerged, and the clan system adapted to reflect the changing landscape and challenges. The elders taught the children that they were following a sacred directive, not simply fleeing or wandering, but moving with purpose. And whenever morale weakened, the prophet's words were repeated like a promise carved into the heart of the nation. Keep moving, keep seeking. The place awaits you. During this vast migration, the Anishinaabe encountered many other indigenous nations. Some welcomed them as relatives returning from a long absence. Others viewed them with suspicion or fear. Negotiations were held at riverbanks. Pipes were shared to signify peace. In some regions, conflict erupted, forcing the people to change course. The prophecy had spoken of this too, of tribes splitting apart, of alliances forming, of paths crossing in unexpected ways. These encounters shaped the identity of the migrating groups, creating bonds and tensions that would echo far into the future. Yet perhaps the greatest challenge the people faced was internal. As generations passed, some began to question the prophecy. Why were they searching for a sign that had yet to appear? Why leave behind familiar lands? Why trust visions from a prophet none of them had ever seen? These doubts spread like shadows, subtle, creeping, and dangerous. For the prophecy had warned of this moment, a time when faith would weaken, and the people would be tempted to settle too soon. The journey westward became a test of unity. Councils met under starlit skies, debating whether to stop or continue. Some leaders urged patience, reminding the people of the teachings. Others argued that the prophecy might have been misunderstood and that perhaps the true homeland lay not west but somewhere they had already passed. The arguments grew heated, and more than once, groups split off in different directions. Some settled permanently, becoming distinct nations over time. Others regrouped and continued pushing west, determined to find the sign no matter how long it took. As the landscape began to change, forests thinning into rolling plains, rivers widening into great inland seas, the migrating people felt a shift. Something was different in the air, in the water, in the soil beneath their feet. Animals they had never seen before roamed these lands. Giants' lakes stretched across the horizon like oceans trapped within the continent. Everything felt foreign yet strangely familiar, as if this was the land of the visions, waiting quietly for their arrival. Then, at last, after generations of searching, a small band of scouts paddling through a marshy inlet made a discovery. Tall stalks swayed gently on the water's surface. Grains clustered like beads, golden in the sunlight. Menumen, the food that grows on water. The prophecy's sign had been found. The news spread like wildfire. Families traveled from distant camps to witness the sacred grain with their own eyes. Elders wept, recognizing the truth of the vision. This was the confirmation they had waited for across centuries of hardship, doubt, and perseverance. They had reached the lands of the Great Lakes, a region that would become the heart of Anishinaabe identity for centuries to come. But the moment of triumph carried an undercurrent of tension. The prophecy had foretold that the people would know the place by this sign, but not that their challenges were over. The discovery of Menumen did not mark the end of the story, but the beginning of a new fire. As the people settled into their new homeland, they did not yet understand that the next phase of the prophecy carried warnings far more ominous than anything they had faced on the migration. The third fire had guided them home. Now, standing among the waters that would sustain them, they felt the warmth of destiny, but also the chill of what lay ahead. The prophecy was unfolding, step by step, and the next fire would bring visions that would change everything they believed about their future. For even as they celebrated the fulfillment of the ancient sign, whispers began to circulate. The fourth fire had already been foreseen, and it spoke of strangers who would arrive from the east, strangers who would test the very survival of the people who had just completed their long journey west. In the generations following the discovery of Menumen, the people felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had reached the land promised by the first prophet, waters rich with life, forests deep with medicine, shores wide enough to hold entire nations. Here, they built villages, held ceremonies, and taught their children the stories that had guided them across half a continent. And yet, even in this moment of peace, the elders knew the prophecy was not complete. Another prophet would soon emerge, one whose words would reverberate through centuries, whose visions would warn of a world no one could yet imagine. No one knows exactly when the second prophet appeared, only that it was during a time of growing prosperity. The people had founded new settlements along the lakes, their canoes traveling effortlessly between trading grounds. Summer gatherings brought together clans from great distances, where marriages were arranged, alliances renewed, and teachings shared. Children played along the shore while the adults worked, hunted, or prepared for winter. Life felt stable, predictable, safe. It was in this era of comfort that the prophecy teaches the next warning must come, for comfort is often when people forget to listen. The prophet arrived like a whisper carried by the wind, first mentioned by a traveler, then by a healer, then by an elder returning from a distant council. Some spoke of a man with eyes that seemed to look through time itself. Others claimed he appeared in dreams before he arrived in person. All agreed on one thing. Wherever he walked, people felt a powerful stillness, as if the world held its breath around him. One account describes him stepping into a gathering circle during a summer council. He did not look like a warrior or leader, no elaborate clothing, no displays of power. Yet when he spoke, the entire lodge fell silent. His voice carried not with force but with clarity, like water rippling under moonlight. He introduced himself as a messenger, not by his own choosing but by the will of the great mystery. His purpose was to bring teachings that would prepare the people for what lay ahead. He spoke of the first fire, the journey already completed, and of its success. The people had followed the sign, endured hardship, and remained united through generations of uncertainty. They had passed the test. But his message did not linger on praise or comfort. Instead, he shifted to the vision of the second fire, a warning that internal divisions would threaten the strength of the nation. He described a time when clans and communities would drift apart, when disagreements would fracture the unity that had carried them across the land. Yet even this warning was not the heart of his message. The prophet spoke of something far stranger, visions of a distant future, a future beyond the memories of the oldest elders. He told of a light-skinned race that would one day appear from across the great waters, a people who would arrive on floating homes so large they would seem like islands. Their clothes would shine like the scales of fish, their weapons would gleam with a strange white metal, and their languages would sound like birdsong and thunder mixed together. At the time, these descriptions made little sense. The Anishinaabe had never seen ships of such size, nor armor made of metal. Their canoes were crafted from birch bark, their tools from stone, bone, copper, or wood. The prophet's words felt surreal, like metaphors or symbols rather than literal predictions. But he insisted they were true, and that the people must be prepared. He spoke of two possible paths. If this light-skinned race came with good intentions, offering peace, respect, and balance, the people could share teachings and walk together toward a prosperous future. But if they came with greed, domination, and a desire to take what was not theirs, a great suffering would unfold. Entire nations would be pushed to the brink of destruction. Families would be torn apart. The land itself would cry out in pain. The prophet's voice filled the lodge with an eerie hush. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, unsure whether to believe such fantastical visions. Some whispered that he was exaggerating or speaking in riddles meant to confuse. Others felt a chill crawl up their spine, sensing that he spoke the truth. He continued, describing how the people must not lose their teachings. "Hold your ways close," he said. "Keep the ceremonies alive. For there will come a time when the world grows dark, and only those who remember the old ways will be able to guide the people back to balance." He urged them to preserve their language, for it carried the wisdom of generations. He warned that if they forgot who they were, the coming strangers would not need to conquer them. They would conquer themselves. One story passed through generations tells of a night when the prophet stood alone at the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast lake. The moon hung low, its reflection shimmering across the water like a path of silver. An elder approached him quietly, asking how he knew these things. The prophet replied that time was a circle, and that he had walked parts of it that others had not yet reached. He spoke of visions, images of worlds far in the future, of roads made of iron stretching across the land, of great thunderbirds made of wood and metal carrying people through the sky. The elder could barely comprehend such details, but he sensed that the prophet did not fear these visions. He respected them as warnings. When the prophet finished sharing his teachings, he told the people that his time was short. He would not remain among them. Like the wind that shifts direction or the tide that retreats from shore, he would move on. Some believed he traveled west, continuing until he reached lands beyond the knowledge of the Anishinaabe. Others believed he returned to the spirit world, his work complete. There are even stories claiming he appeared in multiple places at the same time, as if guided by a force larger than himself. Regardless of what became of him, his message remained. His teachings became the foundation of the second and third fires, preparing the people not only for the migration but for the arrival of the newcomers who would one day reshape the continent. His visions were so strange, so detailed, that only centuries later, when European ships finally appeared on the horizon, did the full weight of his prophecy become terrifyingly clear. For now, however, the people only held the seeds of understanding. They had heard the warnings, but the threat still seemed distant, something that might happen in a far-off age. Yet the prophecy had already been set in motion. The fires would continue to burn, each marking a new era. The people stood at the edge of a story that would stretch far beyond their lifetimes. The prophets had spoken. The warnings had been given. And though few realized it at the time, the appearance of this mysterious messenger marked the beginning of a series of visions that would lead the Anishinaabe into an age of upheaval, transformation, and profound change. The fourth fire was approaching, and with it, the first echoes of the strangers the prophets had described, a future rushing toward the people like a distant storm still unseen beyond the horizon. The search for the prophesied homeland had taken generations, and when the people finally discovered the waters where Menumen grew in tall, golden clusters, there was a tremor of recognition felt by everyone. Elders, healers, children still too young to understand. The lakes shimmered beneath the sunlight, their surfaces rippling with life. Countless inlets, marshes, and hidden bays stretched across the horizon like a labyrinth carved by the Creator. Stands of birch trees offered bark for canoes and lodges. Deer and moose moved through the forests. Fish glided through the waters in abundance. Everything about this place felt alive, sacred, intentional. But the prophecy had warned that the people would know their true home by more than one sign. They were told there would be an island shaped like a turtle, the turtle island symbol embodied in the geography itself. They were told the land would offer healing plants, rich waters, and space enough for great gatherings. And when they reached the shores of what would one day be called the Great Lakes, they found these signs waiting like markers left by the ancestors long before they arrived. The island that resembled a turtle was not merely a myth. Stories speak of a real landmass whose shape mirrored the great turtle from creation stories. Some believed it was Mackinac Island, rising steeply from the water like the shell of a great being. Others believed the turtle-like sign was spread across the region itself, visible in the patterns of the lakes when viewed from high cliffs or imagined through the stories of hunters who traveled great distances. The important thing was not the exact location, but the recognition that the prophecy had guided them true. The land welcomed them, as if acknowledging the long journey that had brought them here. Yet even in this moment of discovery, the people understood one thing clearly. This was not the ending of their story. The prophecy had always indicated that the sign of the Menumen and the turtle would mark the place where a new chapter began, not a final resting point. This land was a stepping stone, a foundation for the future, and therefore the beginning of the next fire. As the people explored their newfound territory, they built villages along the water's edge, using the resources the land provided. They formed alliances with neighboring nations who already inhabited parts of the region. Some interactions were peaceful, built on trade and mutual respect. Others were tense, leading to conflict or negotiations that stretched for years. But through every encounter, the people carried their teachings with them, remembering that the prophecy spoke of unity and balance as essential to survival. In these early years, life centered around the cycles of the lakes and forests. Spring brought the tapping of maple trees, their sap boiled into sweet sugar. Summer gatherings filled the air with songs, drums, and the vibrant colors of clothing decorated with quills and dyes. In autumn, the people harvested Menumen from the water, knocking the grains gently into their canoes with wooden paddles. Winter brought long nights, when families huddled inside lodges and listened to stories that stretched back to the beginning of time. But alongside this thriving life, something else began to take shape, something the prophets had warned of. The teachings of the second fire spoke of a coming age of division. Internal disputes would weaken the people. Clans would disagree on leadership, territory, and the interpretation of the prophecy itself. Elders worried that too much comfort could lead to complacency. Some feared that settling in this new land might make the younger generations forget the hardships of the migration and the reasons behind it. The geography of the region played an unexpected role in this challenge. The Great Lakes were so vast that they created natural boundaries between communities. Villages on opposite shores could go months, or even years, without seeing each other. Over time, small cultural differences began to emerge. Dialects shifted. Traditions adapted to the specific resources available in each region. Though still connected, the people began forming distinct identities as Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, and related groups. Alliances solidified and dissolved like patterns in the water. The prophecy had foreseen this too. It warned that as the people spread across the land, they might begin to forget they were one family. They might forget the unity that had guided them through the migration. And yet these divisions did not immediately destroy them. Instead, They created a complex network of cultures bound by shared ancestry but shaped by unique environments. Still, beneath this diversity, the teachings remained. The elders continued to remind younger generations that the land they now lived upon was sacred, not because it was rich in resources, but because it was the place the ancestors had seen in visions. Every time Menumin swayed in the breeze, its stalks whispering across the water, it was a reminder of why they had come. Every time families paddled across the lakes in birch-bark canoes, they were reenacting a journey far older than their memory. Yet even as the people established themselves in this land, whispers began to spread. Rumors carried by distant travelers, hunters, and merchants who claimed they had seen strange things along the eastern horizon. They spoke of giant homes floating on the water, of men with pale skin, of weapons that gleamed unnaturally. These stories were dismissed at first, fantastical tales like those told by mischievous spirits. But as the reports continued, the elders began to recall the prophet's warning. The people were told that a new age would come, a dangerous one. The land of the Great Lakes was beautiful, generous, alive, but it was not free from the currents of fate. The prophecy of the 7 fires had delivered them here for a reason. This was the place where their future would be tested, where their unity would be challenged, where new relationships, both hopeful and deadly, would emerge. And so the people continued to thrive, unaware that the next fire was drawing near. They fished the waters, walked the forest trails, and danced beneath stars that glittered like scattered embers across the sky. They believed their greatest journey was behind them, but the prophecy knew otherwise. The island of the turtles had brought them to their homeland, yet destiny was already shifting. The next fire waited just beyond the horizon, a fire that would reveal strangers whose arrival would either strengthen the path of peace or ignite a storm that would change the world forever. The years that followed the settlement around the Great Lakes should have been an era of uninterrupted harmony. The land was generous, the waters rich, and the prophecy had guided the people true. Yet, as the elders had warned, prosperity often carries a hidden shadow. Peace can soften vigilance. Abundance can blur memory. And slowly, so slowly that no one noticed at first, the threads that held the people tightly together began to loosen. This was the second fire taking shape, the age of division foretold long before anyone living could remember. The prophecy had warned that the people would stray from the teachings, that arguments and rivalries would rise within the nation itself. And it did not happen through sudden conflict or dramatic betrayal, but through the everyday erosion that comes when distance, time, and differing priorities chip away at unity. The Great Lakes region, vast and beautiful as it was, created natural separations. Villages that had once been a day's journey apart were now divided by stretches of water so wide that entire seasons could pass before families saw one another again. Groups living near Lake Superior faced different challenges than those living near Lake Michigan or Huron. The environment shaped each community in subtle ways. Fishing techniques, hunting patterns, ceremonies tied to local spirits, even the stories told to children began to take on slight variations. This wasn't a loss of culture, far from it. Instead, culture blossomed in many directions at once, forming branches from a shared trunk. But with branching came differences. And with differences came disagreements, sometimes small, sometimes profound. Councils that once spoke with one voice now held debates that stretched long into the night. Should the people expand further west or remain close to the Menumin beds? Should alliances with neighboring nations be strengthened or approached with caution? Whose interpretation of an ancient teaching was correct? Which clan held the most authority in times of dispute? Elders could feel the subtle tremors beneath the calm surface of daily life. They reminded the people of the prophecy, urging them to remember that disunity was not simply a human weakness but a spiritual danger. "We were told this would come," they said. "We must be careful. A people divided is a people vulnerable." But the warnings were hard to heed when life seemed good, when children laughed freely and campfires glowed across the shoreline. Some clans believed they were fulfilling the prophecy better than others. Some leaders feared losing influence. Some communities saw their unique identity as a strength, while others viewed it as a threat. In time, these differences grew into distinct nations: the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, all sharing common ancestry yet developing their own roles and responsibilities within the larger Anishinaabe family. At first, these divisions were peaceful and even practical. The Ojibwe became known as the keepers of medicine, moving farther into forested regions where healing plants were abundant. The Odawa emerged as traders, navigating waterways to connect distant communities through commerce and diplomacy. The Potawatomi became the keepers of the sacred fire, tending to spiritual responsibilities and maintaining important ceremonies. It seemed the divisions could coexist, each group contributing to the greater whole. And perhaps they might have, if not for the subtle tensions that lurked beneath the surface. Some communities grew jealous of others' authority. Others feared resources would become unevenly distributed. And across the landscape, disputes occasionally escalated into conflict. Not full-scale war, but the kind of skirmishes and conflicts that can linger in memory for generations. These were the growing pains of a once unified people learning to live as interconnected but distinct nations. Still, the prophecy's warnings remained clear. This inward struggle would weaken the people at a time when they needed unity the most. For while they debated and disagreed among themselves, forces far beyond their imagination were moving toward the continent. Forces that did not care about clan differences or historic rights or carefully negotiated alliances. Forces that saw opportunity where the Anishinaabe saw homeland. Elders continued to remind the people of the teachings. During winter story nights, they spoke of the first prophet's warning that arrogance, forgetfulness, or internal rivalry could break the harmony of the people. The greatest danger, the prophecy said, may come from within before it comes from without. Yet despite these reminders, the divisions deepened, not enough to destroy the nation, but enough to strain it. There were moments of remarkable unity too, times when leaders from all three major groups gathered to renew their bonds. Ceremonies were held to remind everyone of their shared blood, shared ancestors, and shared destiny. During these gatherings, the sacred bundle was opened, and teachings from the first prophets were retold with fresh urgency. But unity was not constant, and unity, as the prophecy teaches, is not a single moment. It is a decision made again and again. The world was changing, though the people could not yet see how rapidly. Hunters along the eastern coasts brought back strange reports. Merchants returning from long-distance trade told of unusual debris washing ashore. Pieces of wood carved in unfamiliar patterns, scraps of metal shaped by hands unlike their own. Rumors spread of giant floating structures glimpsed briefly and then lost to fog. Most dismissed these sightings as tricks of light or misinterpretations. After all, who could imagine ships the size of islands? Who could imagine a people unlike any encountered before? But the elders felt a shift. The prophecies of the second messenger had spoken of strangers arriving from the east. Strangers whose presence would test the entire nation. And as the second fire spread its embers across the land, the sense of unease grew. The people were prosperous, but prosperity had parted them into branches. And branches, while strong, can break more easily than a unified trunk. The division was not yet catastrophic. It was not yet dangerous, but it was real, and the prophecy made it clear. When the third fire ended and the fourth fire rose, the people would face an arrival that would change the course of history forever. The second fire had shown its lesson. Division had taken root. The next fire would show the consequences. For beyond the eastern horizon, the strangers the prophets spoke of were drawing nearer, carried by waves the people had not yet learned to fear. The divisions that grew among the Anishinaabe did not tear them apart. Instead, they reshaped them. What emerged from the branching was a network of related nations, distinct in custom yet connected through ancestry, language, and prophecy. These newly forming identities, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, spread across the Great Lakes like constellations across the night sky, each shining with its own purpose. And yet, destiny was not finished weaving them together. The teachings of the second fire had warned that divisions would arise, but it also hinted at reunions, unexpected convergences that would bind the people again in ways they could not foresee. This unfolding came to life during the era of the third fire, a time marked not just by migrations, but by encounters so profound that they would shape the political, cultural, and spiritual makeup of the Great Lakes for generations. It began with the movement of families searching for new hunting grounds, richer fishing waters, or better access to trade routes. As some Anishinaabe groups moved eastward, others pushed westward or southward. They often crossed paths in places where forest met shoreline or where rivers gathered into expansive lakes. These meetings were much more than friendly reunions. They were strategic, spiritual, and symbolic moments where the threads of destiny intertwined. In large summer gatherings, entire nations would converge into immense encampments along the shores of the great inland seas. Canoes arrived from distant stretches of land, sleek birchcraft slicing through the mist, carrying families, leaders, healers, and storytellers. Fires were lit across the beaches until the horizon glowed like a tapestry of flickering stars. Here, old bonds were renewed and new alliances formed. Children played with cousins they had never met. Elders exchanged news from faraway territories, and councils were held to address concerns that affected them all. These meetings also revealed the deepening distinctions among the related groups. The Ojibwe had become known for their knowledge of healing plants and their ability to navigate dense forests with uncanny skill. The Odawa, now seasoned traders, traveled vast distances by canoe, returning with copper, shells, obsidian, and stories of lands far beyond the Great Lakes. The Potawatomi maintained sacred fires and held tightly to ceremonies that preserved the spiritual core of the Anishinaabe identity. Despite these differences, there was no sense of rivalry, at least not yet. Instead, there was curiosity and admiration. Each group brought its own strengths, and the gatherings felt like a reunion of a family that had grown in size and responsibility. The prophecy seemed to whisper beneath the murmur of voices and the crackle of fires. You are many, but you are one. But unity was not the only energy at play during these meetings. As the gatherings grew larger, tensions occasionally flared. Conflicts over hunting grounds, fishing territories, and trade routes began to surface. Traditional boundary lines blurred as communities expanded. Some leaders argued for stricter territorial agreements. Others insisted on sharing resources as the ancestors once had. These debates weren't violent, but they were signs that the divisions of the Second Fire still flickered beneath the surface. Yet something extraordinary happened during this era, something the prophecy had subtly predicted. Even as the people splintered into distinct groups, fate continually brought them back together. When one nation faced hardship, whether from harsh winters, disease, or neighboring conflicts, others stepped in to help. The ancestral memory of unity was strong enough to override emerging differences. It was during one such gathering that a critical realization began to take root. Elders from the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi noticed that their paths were not diverging, but spiraling toward a point of convergence. Each group carried a different part of the original teachings: spiritual responsibility, medicinal knowledge, diplomacy, or trade. When these groups came together, the teachings became whole again. This harmony between differences gradually formed what would later become the Council of Three Fires, a powerful alliance built not through conquest, but through prophecy and shared destiny. Though the council itself would not be formally recognized until later eras, the seeds were sown now, in long debates, in shared ceremonies, and in the recognition that each nation played an indispensable role in the collective future. These encounters weren't limited to the three main groups of the Anishinaabe. Migrating bands also crossed paths with distant relatives and other indigenous nations. Some meetings were peaceful, marked by trade and intermarriage. Others were tense, requiring diplomacy or, at times, defensive action. What mattered most was that these interactions shaped the cultural map of the region. Languages blended, traditions mixed, and new stories formed. The people were not isolated. They were part of a vast web of relationships that stretched across the continent. As these migrations and encounters continued, the elders began to sense something shifting. A new energy approaching from the east, subtle but undeniable. Stories came from coastal nations of strange sightings at the edge of the sea. Some described enormous structures floating on the water, their sails billowing like colossal wings. Others spoke of pale-skinned people wearing shells of metal and carrying sticks that made thunder. Few inland nations took these stories seriously. The descriptions were too bizarre, too unimaginable. But when elders of the Anishinaabe gathered, they recalled the prophet's warning. Strangers would eventually arrive from across the water. These strangers would either bring hope and friendship, or they would bring destruction and sorrow. The third fire had prepared the people for migration, for meeting new cultures, and for developing the strength needed to face the unknown. And now, though they did not yet realize it, the age of encounters was coming to a close. The next fire would not be shaped by meetings among relatives, but by the arrival of outsiders unlike anything the people had ever seen. The merging of migrations, the formation of alliances, and the strengthening of identity were all preparing the Anishinaabe for the greatest challenge in their history. Because beyond the horizon, on waters they had not yet crossed, the strangers warned of in the prophecy were drawing nearer, carried by winds that even the strongest medicine men could not hold back. The first signs came quietly, almost imperceptibly, ripples of rumor traveling inward from the distant coasts. Hunters returning from long journeys spoke of strange shapes glimpsed at the edges of great waters. Traders arriving from eastern nations carried unsettling stories of encounters with beings who looked nothing like the indigenous peoples of the land. At first, these tales were dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings. How could they be anything else? The descriptions sounded fantastical, like the kind of spirits children whispered about in the dark. They spoke of floating islands, bigger than any canoe, taller than the tallest pines, moving across the ocean with billowing white wings. They spoke of people with pale skin, unlike any seen before, wrapped in heavy garments and carrying objects that shone blindingly in the sunlight. They spoke of strange scents, foreign spices, unfamiliar smoke, and metals that did not come from the earth in this region. And they spoke of weapons that cracked like thunder and spit fire, capable of killing from distances no bow could reach. Most inland nations had never set eyes on the ocean. The idea of a craft so massive that it could ride the waves seemed impossible. Some elders believed these were signs of powerful spirits. Others suspected distant nations were confusing natural phenomena for fantasy. But the rumors continued, persistent and strangely consistent. The people could not shake the sense that something unprecedented was about to breach the boundaries of their known world. For the Anishinaabe, these stories carried an even deeper weight. The prophecy of the second prophet had spoken of these beings long before any such encounters were possible. The words echoed through the memories of elders. A light-skinned race would one day arrive from the east, wearing garments like the shells of fish and carrying objects that glinted like white stone. Their arrival would mark the beginning of a new era, one that offered two possible futures: harmony or devastation. No one expected those visions to unfold in their lifetimes. Yet the distant sightings felt like the first sparks of a storm. The earliest confirmed encounter came through allied nations living near the coasts. A group of fishermen had spotted, far out at sea, a colossal shape rising from the horizon. At first, they believed it to be a cloud formation, perhaps a spirit island, or a sign from the sky beings. But as it drifted closer, its shape grew sharper, more defined. Its wooden hull was massive, longer than the length of a village clearing. Its sails towered into the sky like the wings of a giant bird. Men walked upon it like ants upon a floating world. When the fishermen relayed what they had seen, their voices trembled, not with fear alone, but with awe. The descriptions circulated rapidly. The people began to gather around advisors and elders, seeking guidance. Who were these strangers? What did they want? Were they the beings the prophecy had warned of? Soon after, more stories arrived, this time not rumors but first-hand encounters. Coastal nations reported meetings with pale-skinned men who carried symbols of strange faiths, spoke in harsh, rapid tongues, and made gestures of peace while clutching weapons capable of thunder. Some encounters were peaceful, gifts exchanged, cautious curiosity shared. Others were tense or violent. Entire villages fell ill with strange fevers after contact, and elders began to suspect these visitors carried invisible forces that harmed without intent. News of these events spread inland with unprecedented speed, reaching the communities of the Great Lakes. When Anishinaabe leaders gathered to discuss the growing threat, the atmosphere was thick with unease. This was exactly what the prophet had described. A people arriving with shimmering garments, walking upon floating islands, carrying thunderous weapons, and bringing with them both opportunities and dangers. The fourth fire, the fire of arrival, had begun to flicker on the horizon. Long before the newcomers reached the Great Lakes, their presence was felt through shifting trade networks. Goods of European origin, iron tools, copper kettles, metal knives, glass beads, began appearing in markets, traveling hand to hand across vast distances. At first, these objects were treated as curiosities, rare items from a faraway world. But as they became more common, the people recognized that the strangers were not merely passing visitors. They were establishing footholds. The arrival of these objects created ripples throughout society. Traditional tools, honed over generations, suddenly competed with metal blades that could cut more efficiently. Copper, once a precious resource symbolically tied to the spiritual world, was now overshadowed by iron traded in bulk. Alliances shifted as nations sought access to these new materials, sometimes strengthening old bonds and sometimes fracturing them. The land itself felt as though it were tilting, adjusting to the weight of a new presence. Even before the strangers themselves became visible, their influence reshaped entire regions. When the first European explorers finally entered the interior, the Anishinaabe met them with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and ceremonial diplomacy. The visitors seemed to glow in their strange armor, as if encased in shells forged by unnatural fire. Their clothing was thick and layered, their faces framed by beards unlike anything seen among indigenous nations. They carried crosses and banners, spoke of distant kings, and performed rituals that appeared foreign and dramatic. The strange sight of these newcomers stirred mixed feelings. Some viewed them as potential allies, bearers of powerful goods and knowledge. Others saw danger in their weapons and their hunger for land. Many felt the prophecy vibrating beneath every interaction, a reminder that this moment had been foretold. In council houses lit by firelight, elders debated what course to take. Should the people welcome these strangers to avoid conflict? Should they avoid contact and protect their homelands? Should they attempt to learn from them or keep them at a distance? The uncertainty was palpable. And then there was the water. Stories of the newcomers' arrival often spoke of a disturbing sight, the way the water seemed to change when their ships arrived. Some said the ocean turned to silver beneath the hulls, as if reacting to the presence of the strangers. Others said the ships left trails of foam that resembled scars upon the surface. Whatever the case, the prophecy's metaphor of the water turning to silver suddenly seemed literal. The shimmering waves beneath the ships looked nothing like the natural movement of lake or ocean waters. It was as if the land and water themselves recognized the newcomers and trembled. What the Anishinaabe could not yet know was how profound the consequences of this moment would be. The arrival of the light-skinned race would reshape not only their own future, but the entire continents. Every teaching, every prophecy, every ceremony would soon be tested. For now, the people could only watch the horizon, listen to the whispers carried by travelers, and wait. The floating islands were coming closer. The strangers were stepping ashore. The fourth fire, the fire of arrival and choice, had begun to burn. And with it, the world the people had known for centuries was about to change forever. The first encounters with the newcomers did not ignite war, nor did they instantly unravel the foundation of Anishinaabe life. Instead, they brought something far more complicated possibility. The prophecy of the fourth fire had spoken clearly of two potential paths. The people would face a choice when the light-skinned race arrived. If the newcomers came with good intentions, a path of peace and shared wisdom could unfold. If they came with greed and deception, the land would fall into great sorrow. This duality, hope and danger intertwined, defined the earliest moments of contact. And in this delicate balance lay the true tension of the fourth fire. When Europeans first reached the Great Lakes region, they arrived not as conquering armies but as explorers, traders, and emissaries. Their approach was cautious, almost tentative. They swiftly realized the indigenous nations were not scattered tribes but complex societies with political structures, alliances, and well-defined territories. These nations held knowledge of the land that newcomers desperately needed to survive. In this early stage, the two sides stood on unfamiliar ground, neither fully understanding the other, yet both curious and cautious. The Anishinaabe people, steeped in diplomacy formed over centuries of intertribal relations, met the newcomers with well-practiced protocols. Elders spoke words of welcome, tobacco was offered, and ceremonies were held to determine whether these strangers walked with good hearts. The newcomers, bewildered by the spiritual depth of these gatherings, often interpreted them through their own cultural lens, sometimes respectfully, sometimes with quiet confusion. At first, the newcomers seemed aligned with the path of peace. They brought gifts, metal tools, wool blankets, kettles, beads. They desired trade more than territory, and in these early years, their numbers were small. Some Anishinaabe leaders believed this was the beginning of the peaceful path the prophecy had described. They saw an opportunity to build alliances and access new goods that could strengthen their communities. There were moments of genuine connection. A few Europeans learned indigenous languages, lived among the people, and adopted aspects of their culture. There were instances of cooperation during harsh winters, shared hunts, and mutual protection against hostile forces. For a brief time, it seemed possible that two worlds might coexist on equal footing. But beneath the surface, shadows began to form. Even in the earliest years, some elders sensed an imbalance. The newcomers brought not just goods but hunger for land, resources, and influence. They sought to map territories, claiming rivers and lakes in the names of distant kings who had never set foot on the continent. They erected crosses and stakes as symbols of ownership, signs that bewildered or angered those who believed land belonged to no one and to everyone. The newcomers also carried invisible dangers, diseases that swept through villages with devastating speed. Fevers, coughs, and strange illnesses struck communities who had no natural resistance. Entire families were wiped out, and some villages were left nearly empty. Even though the newcomers did not understand these diseases themselves, to the Anishinaabe it meant one thing. The prophecy was beginning to unfold in its darker path. The fourth fire warned of a crossroads, a fork in the path. It said there would be a moment when the people must decide how to respond, and that this decision would determine whether the future held harmony or destruction. That moment began when envoys from the newcomers requested formal alliances, agreements written on paper, recorded in languages the Anishinaabe had never seen. These treaties, the newcomers insisted, were symbols of friendship. But elders grew wary. Ink stays, they observed, but spoken promises move with the wind. They had witnessed how easily misunderstandings grew between cultures who interpreted agreements in vastly different ways. Some leaders argued that alliance was necessary to secure peace. Others warned that accepting these treaties would be a trap. The debates became intense, stretching across seasons and regions. Communities were divided, some optimistic, others deeply suspicious. At the same time, European traders began competing for indigenous loyalty. French, British, and later American forces all vied for influence. Each promised protection and wealth. Each encouraged alliances that sowed seeds of future conflict. What began as diplomacy slowly evolved into manipulation. And the newcomers did not arrive alone. They brought wars from their old world. Wars that had nothing to do with the people of this land. Yet the Anishinaabe were caught in the middle, pressured to choose sides. These foreign conflicts forced indigenous nations into positions that threatened long-established alliances, creating rifts that mirrored and magnified the divisions already present from the second fire. The prophecy of the fourth fire speaks of a moment when the newcomers might extend their hand in friendship but carry a knife in the other. This metaphor became real as the Anishinaabe began to witness contradictory behavior. Traders who smiled and shared meals during the day sometimes exploited communities at night. Missionaries who spoke of spiritual salvation denounced ceremonies that had guided the people for thousands of years. Officials who promised fairness simultaneously plotted to expand territorial claims. The fork in the path became clearer with each passing year. One path was narrow and fragile, the possibility of genuine coexistence built on respect, mutual learning, and balanced exchange. A handful of relationships embodied this hope, and their impact would echo for generations. The other path was wider and darker, the road of destruction, deceit, and domination. The elders saw signs of it everywhere. Land quietly being absorbed into colonial maps, new settlements inching closer to ancestral territories, and the slow erosion of the cultural balance that had held the world together. The fourth fire prophesied that the people would face unprecedented challenges, but it also insisted that they must not lose hope. They were told to be cautious, observant, and united. They were told to look beyond appearances and recognize the truth in others' actions, not their words. As the newcomers grew in number and power, the Anishinaabe found themselves walking the edge of both paths, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in danger, but always aware that their choices carried weight far beyond the moment. The fourth fire was a turning point, a moment suspended between two possible futures. Neither had claimed victory yet, but the fifth fire was rising, and with it would come consequences, the darkest era the prophecy had ever foreseen. The early treaties were not signed in great halls or under banners of war. They were agreed upon beside rivers, under the shade of towering pines, around council fires where the smoke curled upward like prayers. The Anishinaabe believed that agreements made in such sacred spaces carried the weight of honesty. After all, the land heard the promises. The waters witnessed the words. Tradition held that no one would dare lie before the spirits that surrounded them. But the newcomers did not come from a world shaped by those same beliefs. At first, the treaties seemed simple agreements for peace, mutual protection, and trade. The newcomers presented them as bonds of friendship, as evidence of goodwill. Words of brotherhood flowed easily. We will be allies. We will share the land. We will respect each other's ways. Some of these early relationships were sincere. There were Europeans who genuinely wished for coexistence, who admired the Anishinaabe and sought meaning in their spirituality and knowledge. Yet even from the start, misinterpretations lay hidden beneath every handshake. To the Anishinaabe, an agreement represented a living, evolving relationship. If circumstances changed, the agreement could be revisited, adapted, or respectfully dissolved. But to the newcomers, a treaty was a fixed document, a contract written in ink that would not bend, regardless of changing realities. This fundamental difference was like a fault line beneath the entire early history of contact. Still, many leaders saw the treaties as a strategic necessity. The newcomers had strange technologies, powerful weapons, and connections to distant nations whose intentions were not yet clear. Maintaining peace, at least temporarily, seemed wise. Trade brought benefits, metal tools, woven cloth, and other goods that made daily life easier. Villages closer to trading posts sometimes prospered, gaining wealth and influence among neighboring nations. But prosperity, like fire, spreads unevenly. Some communities grew suspicious, seeing alliances as dangerous invitations. Others believed cooperation was the only way to prevent conflict. The newcomers sensed these differences and began to exploit them. They offered better trade deals to certain bands while withholding goods from others. They flattered some leaders while ignoring or undermining others. Slowly, deliberately, they reshaped political landscapes that had existed long before their arrival. And then came the broken promises. In one region, a treaty had promised shared hunting grounds as long as the rivers flow. Within a few decades, newcomers fenced off the land, claiming exclusive ownership. In another area, they promised not to build settlements. Yet soon, cabins appeared, followed by fields, followed by roads. Each new settlement brought more people, more demands, more pressure on the land, and fewer places for the Anishinaabe to live according to their traditions. The people watched as the newcomers' maps expanded, carving the land into squares and borders with lines that meant nothing to the natural world. Lakes that had carried canoes for centuries were suddenly renamed. Forests that were once shared hunting grounds were divided into private parcels. The Anishinaabe wondered how anyone could claim ownership over the earth itself. "You can no more own the land," one elder said, "than you can own the sky or the winds." But the newcomers did not understand or did not care. The broken treaties were not always intentional at first. Miscommunication and cultural misunderstanding played large roles. Some European officials genuinely believed they were honoring agreements, while settlers moving into the region ignored them entirely. Yet as years passed, it became increasingly clear that expansion was not simply accidental. It was desired, planned, and justified by beliefs rooted in distant kings and foreign laws. Disease added to the tragedy. Entire villages devastated by illnesses they had never known before left lands seemingly empty, strengthening the newcomers' false argument that the territory was unused or unoccupied. The people grieved not only the loss of loved ones but the disappearance of entire communities, breaks in the chain of memory and tradition that could never fully be healed. The emotional toll was immense. Families displaced from their ancestral homelands wandered through forests where their grandparents had once walked freely. Sacred sites, burial grounds, ceremonial places, vision quest locations were threatened or destroyed. The prophecy of the fourth fire had warned that if the newcomers came with deception, great sorrow would follow. Now that sorrow was taking form. The people began to ask difficult questions in council meetings. Had they misinterpreted the prophecy? Had they trusted too easily? Was it still possible to walk the path of peace? Or had they already entered the darker route the prophet had warned of? The elders urged calm and unity. They reminded their people that treaties, once broken, revealed the true intentions of those who made them. We must watch not what they say, they cautioned, but what they do. Tensions grew with every passing season. Some Anishinaabe bands pushed back, refusing to sign new agreements or challenging encroachments directly. Others believed resistance would bring only war and suffering. Communities found themselves divided not by hatred, but by fear and uncertainty. And then came the moment that crystallized the prophecy's warning. The newcomers began drawing maps that claimed territories far beyond what any treaty had discussed. Lands the Anishinaabe had never agreed to give up were labeled as colonial property. The ink on these maps became a weapon as sharp as any blade or rifle. The fifth fire was beginning to glow on the horizon. The era of broken treaties was not merely a time of political betrayal. It was the foundation of the darkest chapter the Anishinaabe would ever face. The elders could sense it. The young warriors could feel it. The land itself seemed to whisper warnings in the rustling leaves and shifting winds. The people stood on the threshold of an age they did not want, an age foretold long ago. And though they did not yet know the full scale of what was coming, they could see its first shadows creeping across the land. The sorrow of the fifth fire was approaching. The elders had long feared the coming of the fifth fire. It was the most painful of all the prophecies, a warning so dire that some storytellers hesitated to speak of it at all. According to the teachings, this fire would mark an era when the Anishinaabe people would face near destruction. The words were not metaphorical. They were meant as a stark reflection of suffering so deep that it would test the very soul of the nation. For generations, the prophecy had seemed distant, almost symbolic. Surely nothing so devastating could occur on a scale that would threaten the survival of an entire people. But as the decades passed and the presence of the newcomers grew stronger, the signs of the fifth fire began to reveal themselves. Subtle at first, then undeniable, then overwhelming. It began with disease, an invisible force carried unintentionally by the newcomers yet devastating in its impact. Sickness swept through villages in waves. Fevers, coughs, rashes, agonizing pains that healers had never encountered. Traditional medicines, so powerful against the illnesses of the region, could do little against these new afflictions. Some communities lost a third of their people. Others were nearly wiped out altogether. Elders, keepers of memory, tradition, and prophecy, died before they could pass down their knowledge. Entire lines of teachings disappeared. Languages dimmed. Ceremony keepers were lost, leaving cultural voids that would take generations to restore. The land itself seemed to mourn. Smoke from funeral fires drifted across lakes like pale ghosts. Songs once sung with strength were now whispered in grief-stricken voices. Children huddled close to the surviving elders, clinging to stories and comfort even as fear clouded their young faces. The people wondered if this was the sorrow the prophets had spoken of. But the fifth fire had only begun to burn. As disease weakened communities, settler expansion accelerated. The newcomers had grown in number, and with their population came the hunger for land. Fields, forests, and rivers that had been stewarded by indigenous nations for countless generations were now mapped, claimed, fenced, and occupied. The newcomers viewed possession as ownership, a concept foreign to the Anishinaabe worldview. Where the indigenous people saw land as a living relative, the newcomers saw opportunity. Acres to farm, forests to harvest, resources to extract. Treaties that had been signed in good faith were now twisted, reinterpreted, or ignored entirely. Land promised to remain shared or untouched was abruptly taken. Hunting grounds essential for survival were cut off. Access to traditional migration routes became restricted. Food supplies dwindled. For a people whose way of life depended on mobility, environmental balance, and connection to specific places of ceremony and harvesting, these losses were catastrophic. Tensions escalated into violence. Small conflicts flared where settlers encroached on sacred sites or hunting territories. The newcomers often carried superior weapons, guns with range and power that indigenous warriors could not match. The Anishinaabe fought fiercely when forced to defend their homes, but each skirmish strained them further. And then came the missionaries, with their insistence that Anishinaabe spirituality was heathen or dangerous. Ceremonies that had guided the people since time immemorial were now condemned. Sacred items were confiscated or burned. Children were pressured or forced to attend mission schools, where they were taught to reject their language, their identity, and their traditions. Many were punished for speaking the words their ancestors had spoken for centuries. This psychological and spiritual assault struck at the heart of the people. It was not just land that was being taken, it was worldview, memory, cosmology, and self-understanding. The fifth fire also manifested in the rise of alcohol trade, introduced by newcomers who recognized its destructive potential. Alcohol was used as a tool of exploitation, exchanged for valuable furs, lands, and influence. Addictions spread through vulnerable communities already weakened by disease and displacement. Families fractured under the weight of new social stresses, and internal conflicts intensified. The prophecy warned that the people would lose their way during this era, and now, some wandered through life in a haze of grief and confusion, disconnected from the teachings that had anchored their ancestors for generations. But perhaps the most devastating impact of the fifth fire came in the form of forced removals. As settlers and governments tightened their grip, entire nations were uprooted from their territories and pushed westward or into smaller and smaller parcels of land. Some were marched hundreds of miles under brutal conditions. Winter starvation, exposure, and violence took many lives along these forced journeys. Families were separated, sometimes permanently, and with each removal, the people were pushed further from the sacred sites that grounded their cultural practices. Despite all this suffering, the prophecy had promised that a small flame would survive, a fragile ember carried by those who refused to forget. Throughout the darkest days, there were acts of quiet heroism. Elders risked punishment to teach children their language in secret. Medicine people hid ceremonial items in the forests, lakes, and underground pits, preserving them for future generations. Clan leaders held scattered councils, keeping the political structure alive even when it seemed impossible. Grandmothers taught stories in hushed tones late at night, passing them through generations like smuggled treasures. Warriors traveled covertly to deliver messages between fragmented communities, ensuring that the people remained connected despite their dispersal. Even in the face of overwhelming loss, the Anishinaabe spirit refused to disappear. The fifth fire consumed everything it touched: land, lives, traditions, confidence. But it could not extinguish that inner flame. The prophecy had never said the people would be entirely destroyed, only that they would come close. And now, in the midst of this devastation, a strange truth emerged. What survived did so not by chance, but through deliberate, courageous, and often dangerous acts of cultural resistance. The people were battered, wounded, and scattered, yet the flame endured. And according to the prophecy, that flame, the small, flickering ember of identity, language, story, and spirit, would become the foundation for the next era. The sixth fire was approaching, an age of rediscovery, resilience, and return. But for now, the people still lived within the deep shadows of the fifth fire, struggling to make sense of their pain while searching for a path back to themselves. They called them keepers, though the world around them no longer recognized their authority. These were the elders, the storytellers, the medicine people, the quiet resistors who refused to let the final embers of the Anishinaabe spirit go dark. From the outside, it seemed as if their way of life was unraveling. Communities had been scattered, their children taken to mission schools, their ceremonies outlawed, their lands stripped away piece by piece. Many had fallen into grief, despair, or silence. But beneath the surface, beneath the gaze of missionaries, traders, and government agents, something powerful continued to survive. This was the hidden fire of the fifth prophecy. The knowledge that even in the darkest age, a small, guarded flame would remain alive, and it would live in the hearts of those who remembered. The secret keepers were not chosen through formal councils or public declarations. They emerged naturally, quietly, almost invisibly, as if the responsibility had always been written into their spirits. A grandmother who whispered songs in the middle of the night so that her grandchildren would not forget the melodies. A father who carved a small teaching bundle and hid it beneath the floorboards of a cabin. A healer who memorized every plant, every root, every medicine, knowing she might be the last one who could name them all. A storyteller who pretended to adopt the newcomer's ways while secretly carrying the old stories inside his mind, repeating them until they were woven permanently into memory. These keepers became the living libraries of the Anishinaabe. Long before books or recording devices, knowledge was held in the human mind, in the way an elder's voice paused at certain moments, in the cadence of a song, in the placement of hands during a ceremony. The newcomers believed they could destroy a culture by destroying objects, burning drums, confiscating pipes, or banning rituals. They did not understand that the heart of the Anishinaabe world was invisible. It lived in stories transmitted across generations like an unbroken thread. And so even as laws forbade gatherings, even as missionaries threatened punishment, and even as children were ripped from their families, the old teachings persisted in quiet ways. Some gatherings happened in places no newcomer would bother to look. Deep forest clearings where pine needles blanketed the earth and muffled footsteps. Hidden valleys where singing could echo without being heard. Remote lockshores where only those who knew the paths could find their way. Fires were lit low to avoid detection. Bundles were opened only with utmost secrecy. Ceremonies that had once been performed boldly, proudly, now unfolded with the weight of danger pressing on every breath. But still they unfolded. In these circles, elders taught the prophecies again, the seven fires, the origin stories, the clan responsibilities, the old ways of living in balance with the land. They knew they were risking imprisonment or worse. But they also knew that if the teachings were not passed on, the people would lose themselves entirely. One elder once whispered, "If even one child remembers a single song, the spirits will not abandon us." That belief guided them like a compass through the shadows. Some forms of resistance were subtle but deeply effective. Parents gave their children Anishinaabe names in private, even if they were forced to use Christian names in public. Women taught their daughters how to bead patterns that told stories, embedding history into clothing and jewelry that outsiders saw only as decoration. Men carved clan animals into hidden places, inside lodge poles, beneath canoe seats, etched lightly into tools, leaving coded messages for future generations. Even as the formal political structures crumbled under colonial pressure, clan responsibilities were preserved quietly. Members of the Bear clan continued to protect the people, sometimes by acting as buffers between newcomers and their communities. Members of the Fish clan continued to serve as thinkers and problem solvers, helping families navigate the confusion of a changing world. Members of the Crane and Loon clans found ways to counsel and mediate disputes, maintaining harmony where possible. And in the heart of these secret efforts were the grandmothers, the Nokomis who possessed a strength that colonial authorities vastly underestimated. They comforted children who returned from mission schools traumatized, speaking to them softly in the language forbidden by white teachers. They hid sacred objects wrapped in cloth and stored in hollowed logs, or buried near roots of ancient trees. They taught creation stories at dawn, when the world was quiet enough for voices to rise without attracting attention. There were also those who walked two worlds, individuals who learned the newcomers' languages, pretended to adopt their customs, but used that knowledge to protect their people. These interpreters, diplomats, and intermediaries became invisible shields, ensuring that some agreements were softened, some punishments lessened, some opportunities preserved. They often lived lonely lives, misunderstood by both sides, but they carried an immense responsibility. The secret keepers kept alive not only stories and ceremonies, but also hope. Hope that the darkness of the fifth fire would not last forever. Hope that one day their people would reclaim what had been lost. Hope that the future generations, those not yet born, would remember who they were meant to be. The prophecy had said that a small flame would survive, a spark carried by those who refused to forget. It was true. Despite sickness, land theft, forced assimilation, and cultural suppression, the flame endured. It flickered dimly yet defiantly in sweat lodges built in hidden places, in lullabies sung softly enough to seem like humming, in bundle teachings whispered behind closed doors. The newcomers believed that assimilation was inevitable. Missionaries believed that conversion would erase indigenous identity. Government officials believed that laws could extinguish culture. They were wrong. What they could not see, what they could never understand, was that the seeds of the future were already being planted in silence. The secret keepers were protecting not just memories, but the future generations who would one day rekindle the fire openly. The prophecy promised that after the destruction of the fifth fire, a new era of awakening would begin. Those who remembered, even if only a little, would form the foundation of that renewal. The people were wounded, scattered, and grieving. Yet beneath that suffering, a force stronger than despair continued to breathe. And soon, without warning, the lessons preserved in quiet places would ignite the next age. The sixth fire, the fire of rediscovery and return, was preparing to rise from the hidden embers kept alive by those who refused to let the flame die. The sixth fire did not begin with ceremony. It did not begin with a prophet stepping forward, nor with the lighting of a sacred flame, nor with a collective declaration that a new era had arrived. Instead, it began softly, almost imperceptibly, like a heartbeat slowly returning after a long, painful silence. It began in the quiet moments when people who had been taught to forget suddenly felt the pull of memory. It began in the way a child asked a forbidden word, or in the way an elder glanced toward the forest as if hearing a familiar song carried by the wind. After the turmoil and devastation of the fifth fire, the Anishinaabe people were left scattered, wounded, and exhausted. Many had lost their homelands. Many had lost their families to disease, war, or removal. Many had been forced into mission schools where their language was beaten out of them, their hair cut, their identities stripped away. The newcomers believed that the culture had been extinguished, that assimilation had succeeded. But the prophecy had said otherwise. The sixth fire promised that a time would come when the grandchildren of those who survived the darkest days would begin searching again. Searching for their identity, their language, their ceremonies, and their purpose. These descendants, the prophecy said, would grow up in a world shaped by colonial influence yet feel an inexplicable emptiness, a longing they could not name. This spiritual hunger would lead them back to the teachings saved by the secret keepers. At first, this awakening happened slowly. A young man would find an old drum stored in his grandmother's trunk and ask what it meant. A woman returning from boarding school would hear her grandfather humming an ancient melody and feel tears rise without knowing why. Children raised with English as their first language would suddenly want to learn the words their ancestors once spoke so fluently. These moments were small, but they spread like sparks through dry grass. Then the sparks grew. Elders who had once been afraid to share their knowledge began to speak again. Not loudly or publicly, but with new determination. They gathered young people in kitchens, basements, or remote clearings in the woods. They taught them songs, dances, ceremonies, and stories that had nearly vanished. They restored names, clan identities, and responsibilities. Some carried bundles that had not been opened in decades. When the wrappings were undone, the air seemed to thicken with spirit, as though ancestors were stepping forward, relieved that their teachings were being welcomed again. The rebirth did not come without conflict. The scars of the fifth fire ran deep. Entire generations had been raised without connection to their culture, and for many, shame and confusion lingered. Some felt caught between two worlds, neither of which fully embraced them. Others struggled to understand teachings that had been preserved only in fragments. Still others feared punishment. Churches, schools, and governments had spent generations convincing indigenous people that their culture was sinful or illegal. Yet the longing grew stronger than the fear. Across the Great Lakes region, small cultural revivals began to emerge. Language classes sprouted in community centers. Young people traveled hundreds of miles to spend time with respected elders. Gatherings once held in secret slowly stepped into the open. Drums were heard again, not just in private circles, but at powwows and public events where communities reclaimed their identity with pride. The Manoomin harvest, once banned or regulated, returned as a powerful symbol of cultural survival. Families paddled again through rice-filled waters, knocking grains into their canoes just as their ancestors had done for centuries. Children laughed as they learned, elders smiled through tears, and the people felt themselves reconnecting to the land in ways that colonial forces had tried desperately to sever. The revival extended beyond tradition. It reached into art, politics, education, and activism. Indigenous artists created powerful works inspired by ancestral stories. Scholars researched histories long dismissed by Western academics. Activists formed movements to defend water, land, and treaty rights. The people began to speak openly about the trauma of the past, and in doing so, they began to heal. In these transformations, the prophecy's words became strikingly clear. In the time of the sixth fire, the people will begin to remember, and remember they did. Some learned their language not from elders but from recorded archives or dusty notebooks kept by anthropologists. Some relearned dances by studying the movements of other indigenous nations who had preserved similar traditions. Some pieced together fragmented teachings the way one reconstructs a broken pot, carefully, respectfully, knowing that even if not all pieces fit perfectly, the spirit of the vessel remains. The revival was not uniform. Some communities flourished quickly. Others struggled to reclaim what had been nearly erased. But everywhere, the same truth emerged. The flame the secret keepers had preserved through the darkness was now growing, gaining strength as it passed from one generation to the next. And yet, even as this restoration unfolded, there was something more, something deeper, something urgent that hummed beneath the surface. The sixth fire was not meant to be a steady era of peace. It was a bridge between the sorrow of the fifth fire and the revelation of the seventh. The prophecy taught that the people would rediscover their identity just in time, because the seventh fire would bring a choice, one that affected not only the Anishinaabe but all people living on the land known as Turtle Island. Environmental decline, economic instability, cultural clashes, and global crises were gathering like storm clouds. The world was approaching a turning point, and those who walked the path of the sixth fire could feel it. They could sense that the revival of their traditions was not only an act of healing, it was preparation. Preparation for a choice humanity would soon be forced to make. The people were remembering who they were. The flame was rising, and through the voice of the prophecy, a question lingered. Would the seventh fire bring healing or destruction? The answer would depend on what happened next. The seventh fire was not foretold as a simple event, nor as a distant metaphor for future generations to ponder without consequence. It was described as a reckoning, a crossroads unlike any the people had ever faced. Where the earlier fire spoke of migrations, conflicts, arrivals, and rebirths, the seventh fire focused on a single monumental truth. Humanity would reach a moment when it must choose its path, and that choice would shape the fate of the world for centuries to come. The elders spoke of it with both reverence and fear, for the seventh fire held the weight of every fire that came before it. Everything the people had endured, suffering, loss, survival, revival, was leading to this moment. And whether the future unfolded in harmony or devastation depended not on prophecy, but on the choices of people living in the modern age. To understand the seventh fire, One must return to the words spoken by the prophets long before the arrival of Europeans, long before the Great Lakes became crisscrossed with borders, highways, and concrete cities. The prophets described the seventh fire as a time when the world would become unbalanced, when human beings would lose their connection to the land, to each other, and to themselves. They warned of environmental collapse, spiritual emptiness, and widespread confusion. They said people would forget the original instructions, the teachings that governed how to care for Mother Earth. But they also spoke of hope. They said a generation would rise, often referred to as the seventh generation, who would renew the old ways and lead humanity toward a new understanding of its place in the world. These young people would be both indigenous and non-indigenous. They would see through illusions of progress that harm the earth and rediscover values that had sustained communities for thousands of years. They would reject the idea that nature exists for profit. They would recognize the importance of balance, respect, humility, and interdependence. And yet, even as these teachings carried hope, the prophecy contained a terrible warning. If the people choose the wrong path, the seventh fire will be the last fire. The world would face collapse, environmental, social, and spiritual. Water would become unsafe to drink. Forests would fall. Animals would disappear. Communities would fracture. The land would grow weary from being exploited beyond its limits. Humanity, disconnected from its sacred responsibilities, would spiral into crisis. But if the people chose the right path, the prophecy said, the seventh fire will light the eighth fire, the fire of eternal peace. It is this duality, this split vision, that makes the seventh fire the most mysterious and urgent of all. As the sixth fire awakened cultural revival among the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples, elders began to discuss the seventh fire openly again. They recognized signs all around them that the prophecy was no longer distant. It was happening now. The land was changing. Winters were growing inconsistent. Summers were hotter, drier, more dangerous. The once reliable rhythms of the natural world were shifting in unpredictable ways. Animals moved differently, plants bloomed strangely, weather patterns twisted into unfamiliar shapes. Scientists labeled it climate change. Elders called it what the prophecy had warned, the earth crying out. Forests that had stood for centuries were being cut down for development. Lakes that had fed generations grew polluted from industrial runoff. Rivers once clean enough to drink from became unsafe. Entire species disappeared. And everywhere, the effects of greed and imbalance became impossible to ignore. This was exactly what the prophets had foreseen. But something else was happening, something profoundly hopeful. Across the continent, young people were rising to defend the land. Indigenous youth standing against pipelines, protecting water, reviving languages, rebuilding ceremonies, and demanding a return to balance. Their allies, people of all backgrounds, joined them, recognizing that the struggle for Earth's survival transcended culture and nationality. The unity the prophets had envisioned was becoming reality. Elders saw this and nodded. The seventh fire, they said softly, is being lit. Across many communities, the words of the prophecy were spoken again with renewed meaning. At the time of the seventh fire, a new people will emerge. They will retrace the steps of their ancestors to find what was left by the trail, the teachings. This rediscovery was happening everywhere. Traditional foods returned to diets. Ceremonies once nearly lost were revived. Young people sought knowledge from the old ones. Indigenous scientists, activists, artists, and scholars blended ancient teachings with modern tools to fight for the future. Non-indigenous people began to question consumerism, capitalism, and systems that prioritized profit over life. These shifts reflected a broader awakening, a global cry for something deeper, truer, more sustainable than the world as it had been built in the last few centuries. And yet, beneath the momentum of change, danger loomed. Corporations fought to maintain control of land and resources. Governments resisted indigenous sovereignty. Climate disasters intensified. Many people still clung to destructive habits. The prophecy made it clear. The seventh fire is not a guarantee. It is a test. Humanity stands at a crossroads, just as the Anishinaabe prophets warned. One path leads toward the eighth fire, a world of reconciliation, cultural renewal, ecological restoration, and global unity. A world where people work with the land instead of against it. A world healed by shared wisdom. The other path leads toward the final extinguishing of the flame, a collapse from which recovery may be impossible. This is the heart of the seventh fire's warning. The prophecy is now in our hands. The elders say that the choice is already unfolding. They see the courage of young protectors standing in front of pipelines. They see the rise of indigenous-led environmental movements. They see people across the world calling for justice, balance, and truth. But they also see greed, denial, and destruction expanding at a terrifying pace. The seventh fire is not an era to wait for. It is the era we are living in. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between activism and destruction, between hope and fear, the potential for the eighth fire flickers. The prophecy assures us that peace is possible, but only if humanity chooses it, actively, decisively, collectively. As the elders often say, the prophecy does not predict the future, prepares us for the future. And now that the seventh fire has been lit, the future depends on the choices we make today, not just as communities or nations, but as a species standing at the edge of its own destiny. The world of the seventh fire did not emerge overnight. It arrived slowly, steadily, like the rising of a long-dormant tide. And as it rose, the modern world began to reveal troubling cracks, fault lines that mirrored the warnings the prophets had spoken centuries before. What had once been considered metaphor now felt alarmingly literal. What had once been dismissed as ancient symbolism now read like a map of the present. Across North America, and indeed across the entire planet, signs of imbalance multiplied. The land groaned under the weight of extraction. Waters that had nourished life for millennia turned toxic. Animals changed their migration patterns or disappeared entirely. Forests burned with unprecedented intensity, sending plumes of smoke into skies already heavy with pollution. Seasonal cycles, once reliable as the beat of a drum, shifted unpredictably. Winters arrived late or not at all. Summers lingered with blistering heat. Storms intensified, tearing apart coastlines and cities alike. To many, these were simply environmental issues. To the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples, however, they were the unmistakable fulfillment of the ancient warnings. The prophecy had said that when humans began to live out of balance, taking too much, offering too little, the earth would respond. It would not punish but react the same way a body reacts to injury or infection. The prophets described a future in which the land would speak loudly, trying to remind humanity of its responsibilities. They said the waters would grow sick, the animals would become messengers of danger, and the world would stand on the edge of a great decision. Now, the truth of these teachings was unavoidable. In cities, people felt a different kind of imbalance, one of spirit, identity, and meaning. Despite unprecedented technological advancement, many felt isolated, anxious, or disconnected. Depression and loneliness grew even as communication became faster. Communities frayed. Families drifted apart. People chased ever-increasing consumption, yet felt emptier than ever. The prophecy had spoken of this too. A time when people would forget how to live, when material wealth would overshadow spiritual health, when progress would be measured in profit rather than harmony. The modern world seemed to be living these words with perfect precision. At the same time, political divisions deepened. Nations once proud of their unity became fractured by ideology, misinformation, and fear. Trust in institutions eroded. Governments struggled to address crises they had ignored for decades. Many people felt the world shifting beneath their feet, unsure where to turn for guidance. Yet even amid the growing turmoil, a powerful countercurrent began to rise. Indigenous voices, long silenced or ignored, were being heard again. Scientists, scholars, activists, and ordinary citizens began to recognize the wisdom embedded in indigenous teachings. Concepts such as stewardship, sustainability, kinship with the earth, and long-term thinking gained traction in mainstream conversations. 7 generations thinking, once dismissed as outdated spirituality, became a model for environmental planning. Traditional ecological knowledge informed climate science. Indigenous languages, which encode relationships with nature, were revived in classrooms and community gatherings. The world, in its crisis, was turning back toward the very teachings the prophets had told humanity to remember. But this awakening did not rise peacefully. It emerged from conflict. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, indigenous nations engaged in fierce struggles to defend the land. The prophecy said that during the seventh fire, the people would be forced to confront choices that would determine the future. Those choices manifested as battles over pipelines, mines, deforestation, and water rights. From the Standing Rock Sioux tribe resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline, to the Wet'suwet'en defending their territories, to Ojibwe nations protecting Manoomin beds from pollution, these were not isolated conflicts. They were manifestations of the seventh fire's warning. Humanity must choose whether to honor the earth or continue destroying it. In these fights, young people stood at the front lines. Many had grown up disconnected from their ancestral languages or ceremonies, yet felt a powerful pull toward their roots. They carried signs that read, "Protect the water, honor the treaties, and we are still here." The world watched as they stood unarmed before militarized police, bulldozers, and corporate interests. Many elders wept watching these scenes, recognizing the prophecy unfolding before their eyes. The prophecy had said, "In the time of the seventh fire, the new people will emerge." These were the new people, youth reclaiming their roles as protectors, dreamers, and catalysts of change. Their activism inspired millions. They formed alliances with environmentalists, scientists, faith leaders, and ordinary citizens. Non-Indigenous people, too, began to awaken, recognizing that modern society had severed its connection to the land, and that the price of this severance was becoming unbearable. Throughout the world, this awakening manifested in different ways. People turning toward sustainable living and rejecting disposable culture. Movements demanding justice for marginalized communities. Renewed attention to ancestral foods, medicines, and farming practices. A global push to restore forests, rivers, and ecosystems. Increased recognition of indigenous land rights as vital for planetary health. Yet the prophecy also warned that the seventh fire would be a time of great turmoil, because change would not come easily. The old systems, fueled by greed, extraction, and short-term thinking, would resist transformation. They would cling to power, often violently. Humanity would find itself pulled between two worlds, one collapsing, one emerging. This struggle defined the era. The Anishinaabe elders often explained it simply. The seventh fire is the battle between remembering and forgetting. Remembering means choosing balance, humility, and harmony with nature. Forgetting means continuing down a path of destruction, denial, and disconnection. And the world now stands at this threshold. Wildfires tear through forests that once symbolized stability. Oceans rise, glaciers melt, species vanish. Corporations continue to extract resources even as ecosystems break under the pressure. People feel a sense of urgency unlike any in living memory. The signs are everywhere. The choice is unavoidable. The prophecy does not say how humanity will choose. It only says that the choice must be made. For the Anishinaabe, this moment is not theoretical. It is personal. It is ancestral. It is spiritual. Every line of the prophecy, every lesson of the elders, every echo of intention from generations past converges in this time. The seventh fire is not a far-off myth. It is the reality shaping the present. It is a test of all humanity, and the world stands balanced on its edge, swaying between despair and hope. What comes next depends on the decision made collectively, in governments, communities, homes, and hearts. Because the seventh fire carries within it the spark of something extraordinary. The possibility of the eighth fire, an age of peace, unity, and restored harmony. But that spark will ignite only if humanity chooses to listen, to change, and to walk lightly upon the earth again. The path is before us. The warnings have been given, and the world, like the people, must decide which fire to follow. The seventh fire continued to burn across the land, But its flames did not flare in grand displays or dramatic ceremonies. Instead, they moved quietly through the hearts of those rising to defend what remained sacred. These were the protectors, the water defenders, the land guardians, the youth movement leaders, who stepped forward not out of obligation, but out of a profound, instinctive recognition that something was terribly wrong and desperately needed to be made right. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were teachers, artists, students, hunters, mothers, and grandfathers. People who had grown tired of watching rivers choke on pollution and forests fall under machines. People who felt the heartbeat of the earth growing faint. Their message echoed across nations and cultures. Water is life. Emanai Wikoni. Nibi Bimediziwin. The water gives us life. These words were not new. They had been spoken by elders for countless generations. But now, in the age of the seventh fire, they became a rallying cry, a spiritual summons that reached far beyond indigenous communities and into the global consciousness. The world was beginning to hear them. The rise of modern water protectors did not happen by accident. It emerged from centuries of imbalance. Polluted rivers, poisoned fish, dying lakes, and governments failing to uphold treaty promises. As pipelines cut through sacred lands, as corporations sought permission to exploit resources that did not belong to them, the prophecy began to unfold in ways both heartbreaking and astonishingly precise. One of the most powerful expressions of this awakening happened at Standing Rock in 2016. It began with a small group of Lakota and Dakota youth running across the plains to protest the Dakota Access Pipeline, carrying a message of resistance and hope. Their movement grew into one of the largest indigenous-led protests in modern history. Tens of thousands of people from around the world gathered in solidarity. Tribes who had once been divided by history now stood side by side, joined by allies of every background, every religion, every race. The Anishinaabe elders watching from the Great Lakes understood the deeper meaning. This was the seventh fire illuminating the path, lighting the hearts of the new people. It was not just a protest, it was a prophecy in motion. They saw the same awakening within their own territories. Along the loch shores of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ontario, the Ojibwe nations continued their centuries-old fight to protect Manoomin, the wild rice gifted by prophecy. The same grain that had guided their ancestors during the Great Migration was now threatened by mining pollution, pipelines, and water diversions. The fight to protect Manoomin was not merely symbolic, it was literal survival. Manoomin is more than food. It is identity, culture, and sacred responsibility. And the people rose to defend it with fierce devotion. Elders reminded the youth of a teaching. We were told to protect the food that grows on water. If we can no longer care for it, we lose who we are. In 2018, tribal activists in Minnesota launched massive resistance against the Line 3 pipeline expansion. Camps formed, inspired by the spirit of Standing Rock. Women led water ceremonies at dawn, their songs floating across misty rivers. Young protectors locked themselves inside segments of pipeline to halt construction. Elders offered prayers as police forces arrived in riot gear. These scenes were painful, tense, and often violent, but they revealed something extraordinary. The prophecy living through the actions of ordinary people. Similar movements erupted across the continent. In British Columbia, the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs defended their sovereign territory against pipeline intrusion. In Hawaii, native Hawaiians protected Mauna Kea, a sacred mountain threatened by massive telescope construction. In the Amazon, indigenous nations risked their lives to stop deforestation. In the Arctic, Inuit leaders spoke against drilling that threatened their ancestral hunting grounds. Each of these battles was unique, yet all were connected by a single thread: the defense of Mother Earth. These movements weren't only about land, they were about memory. They were about reclaiming teachings nearly lost during the Fifth Fire. They were about healing wounds inflicted by colonization, residential schools, and cultural suppression. For many young activists, joining the struggle to protect the land became inseparable from the struggle to reclaim language, reconnect with ceremony, and restore ancestral pride. And in the midst of this resurgence, something remarkable happened. Activists began quoting the Seven Fires prophecy, often without realizing its full depth. Phrases such as, "We are the seventh generation," and "This is the time of the seventh fire," appeared on signs, banners, and speeches. The prophecy, once shared in hushed circles around winter fires, was now being invoked on global stages. Indigenous youth stood before cameras and microphones, echoing the teachings of their ancestors. We were told a generation would rise to protect the land. We were told people from all nations would come together. We were told we must choose the path of healing. It was as if the embers carried by the secret keepers during the fifth fire had now burst into flame in the hands of their descendants. These young protectors were not naive. They understood the weight of their struggle. They faced intimidation, violence, legal threats, and public criticism. Yet their determination did not falter. They were driven by something deeper, a connection to land, identity, and responsibility that no government or corporation could extinguish. For many, activism became a form of ceremony. Songs were sung before entering protest lines. Prayers were offered before speaking to government officials. Elders blessed the movements with traditional medicines. In this way, environmental resistance blended with spiritual renewal. The land became the classroom. The movement became the teacher. The prophecy became the compass. The seventh fire had foretold that the people would return to the teachings left along the trail. And here it was happening, through marches, through vigils, through court cases, through ceremonies held under open skies with cameras watching. This was not a hidden revival like the sixth fire. It was a collective, public reclamation of identity and purpose. But there was something even more profound. Something the elders had spoken of but rarely in such explicit terms. The protectors were not acting alone. The land was fighting with them. Rivers flooded pipelines. Storms delayed construction. Equipment failed inexplicably. Forests regrew in patterns that protected sacred spaces. Animals appeared in unusual ways, guiding activists toward safety or signaling danger. Many protectors believed the land itself had agency, that it was choosing to fight for its own life. This belief reflected one of the oldest Anishinaabe teachings. The land is alive, aware, and responsive. To the prophecy, this meant one thing. The seventh fire was not merely symbolic. It was active. It was awakening. But the prophecy also warned of urgency. It said the seventh fire would not last forever. The window to choose the right path would be limited. If the world failed to act, the chance for the eighth fire could be lost. And so, the messages of the water protectors became clearer, louder, more desperate. Not out of fear, but out of love. Love for the land. Love for future generations. Love for the ancestors who had carried the teachings through unimaginable darkness. Protect the water, they said. Protect the land. Protect the sacred. Our future depends on the choices we make today. These voices, young and old, indigenous and non-indigenous, became the heartbeat of the seventh fire. They carried the prophecy into city streets, university classrooms, courtrooms, United Nations forums, and the digital world. Their words echoed across continents. Their courage ignited global movements. Their presence reminded everyone that prophecy is not a story of the past. It is a living force that demands action. The water protectors were not merely activists. They were the messengers of the seventh fire. They were the bridge between ancient teachings and modern urgency. They were the ones calling humanity toward the right path, the path that might finally lead to the eighth fire. The seventh fire illuminated the world in ways both visible and invisible, through uprisings of youth, the resurgence of indigenous identity, and a growing global recognition of ancient truths. But beneath these movements lay something older, quieter, and far more mysterious. Something that had been whispered about even among the elders, the possibility of an eighth fire. Unlike the first 7 fires, which were spoken of openly, the eighth fire lived in a shadowy space between prophecy and legend. Some said it was a promise. Others said it was a warning. Many insisted it was not to be spoken of carelessly, because it did not yet exist, not fully, not in the way the earlier fires did. And yet, hints of it appeared in stories, in symbols, in songs whose meanings had been half forgotten through generations of suppression and survival. To speak of the eighth fire is to speak of hope, but a hope so profound, so delicate, so dependent on human choice that the elders treated it like sacred glass. It was never guaranteed. It was conditional. It would come only if humanity walked the path of balance, humility, and renewal. And in the age of the seventh fire, when the world strained under the weight of its own choices, people began to search for signs that this final fire might be possible. The search did not begin in universities or political movements. It began in the quiet places, by rivers at dusk, in forest clearings, in smoke-filled lodges where teachings were shared in whispers. Elders told stories of an eighth flame that would burn brighter than all the others. A flame of unity where indigenous and non-indigenous peoples would walk together, holding equal respect for one another and for the land. Some said the eighth fire would represent the final healing of the circle, the moment when humanity finally learned to live in balance. But these were not the only clues. Over the centuries, hints of an eighth flame had been woven into petroglyphs, wampum belts, birchbark scrolls, and ceremonial songs. These symbols were often overlooked by outsiders, but to those who carried cultural knowledge, they were unmistakably deliberate markers left behind like hidden messages for future generations. One of the most compelling clues lay in the Midwawin birchbark scrolls. These sacred records, carved and inked by the Maid priests, depicted the seven flames as sequential circles or paths, each representing an era of transformation. But on some scrolls, researchers noticed something strange. A faint, incomplete symbol, an eighth circle, or sometimes a flame-like shape, drawn lightly, as if intentionally unfinished. Elders explained that this was not an accident. The eighth circle was left open because the eighth fire had not yet arrived. Its completion depended on the actions of the people living at the time of the seventh fire. Another clue appeared in certain wampum belts, especially those used to record agreements between nations. Some belts had patterns of 7 white diamonds representing the 7 fires, but in rare belts, an 8th diamond appeared, slightly faded, or woven differently, or positioned separately. Some historians dismissed this as stylistic variation. Elders disagreed. They said the 8th symbol represented a future path, one that could only be walked if peace and unity were chosen after the 7th fire. There were also stories that seemed too obscure to connect to the main prophecy, yet too persistent to ignore. Some told of a light at the end of the trail, a fire so pure it could not be seen by eyes clouded with greed. Others spoke of a time when the ancestors themselves would return, not as spirits or dreams, but as voices guiding humanity toward reconciliation. Still others described the 8th fire as the rebirth of the world, a time when the earth would heal from centuries of wounds and breathe freely once more. But perhaps the most mysterious hint of all came from songs, ancient ceremonial songs passed down orally through generations. Some of these songs contained verses that elders said were for the future. A verse of one such song, rarely shared publicly, contained a cryptic line: "When the 7th light dims, the 8th will rise if the hearts of the people turn toward the earth." This line was not part of the official 7 fires prophecy as recorded by anthropologists or early missionaries. It was part of the living memory, carried by families who had survived the darkest days of cultural suppression. It reflected a belief that the 8th fire was not merely an extension of the prophecy, it was its ultimate purpose. The more the 7th fire unfolded around the world, the more people began to notice these hints. Scholars studying indigenous records found themselves astonished by the precision of the earlier fires. Environmental scientists, unaware of indigenous prophecy, described the present moment as a planetary crossroads. Social movements rose with language that mirrored the teachings without knowing their origins. And everywhere, the same theme appeared: humanity was being asked to choose its future. This growing recognition led some to wonder, what if the 8th fire is not just a spiritual metaphor? What if it is a literal era, one triggered by collective human choice? What if history itself is structured within the fires, unfolding like a map toward a destination? Such questions, though speculative, held profound resonance. Within many indigenous communities, elders began speaking more openly about the 8th fire, sensing that the time for secrecy was fading. They said the world was entering a moment when ancient knowledge was needed, not as nostalgia, but as guidance for survival. They spoke of the eighth fire as a time when indigenous and non-indigenous people would walk together. Not one leading the other, not one dominating the other, but both moving forward as equals, united by shared respect for the land. Some even suggested that the eighth fire was beginning to flicker, that small, faint sparks had already appeared. The rise of global indigenous rights movements, the return of traditional foods and medicines, the resurgence of languages once nearly lost a growing recognition of the earth's sacredness. Young people rejecting systems of exploitation, alliances forming between nations, cultures, and movements. These were not yet the flames of a new era, but they were undeniably embers, bright enough to be seen, fragile enough to be extinguished. And that fragility was the heart of the mystery. The eighth fire could not ignite on its own. It required something humanity had never fully achieved: widespread unity, reconciliation, healing, and ecological balance. It required people to remember what had been forgotten, to repair what had been broken, and to choose respect over dominance. It required modern society to finally understand what indigenous cultures had always known. The earth is not a resource, it is a relative. The elders said, if the people choose the right path in the seventh fire, the eighth fire will come. But if they choose the wrong path, there will be no eighth fire. This was not a threat. It was a truth, because the eighth fire represents nothing short of a global transformation, a shift in the consciousness of humanity itself. Its appearance depends on whether the world chooses healing over destruction, humility over greed, connection over isolation. And in the age of the seventh fire, as movements rise and systems crumble, as climate disasters intensify and alliances strengthen, as the past reawakens and the future hangs uncertain, one question grows louder than all others. Is the eighth fire beginning to awaken, or is it slipping away before it can ever ignite? In the next era of the prophecy, humanity will discover the answer. The prophets of the seven fires were not kings. They were not generals. They did not rule armies, command nations, or write their teachings in stone. They appeared quietly, sometimes in visions, sometimes as wanderers, sometimes as children whose words carried wisdom far beyond their years. They lived in eras long before the first Europeans reached North America, long before nations were carved into borders, long before history as we know it was written down. And yet, these prophets somehow foresaw events that would unfold centuries after their deaths, describing them with a clarity that still astonishes scholars, elders, and historians today. Who were these prophets? How did they know what they knew? And what did they truly see? To understand them, we must return to a time when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was not rigid or questioned. It was a natural part of life. The Anishinaabe understood existence as interconnected layers. The seen world and the unseen, the waking world and the dream world, the present and the ancestral past. A prophet was not merely a visionary. They were a messenger, a bridge between these layers. Their legitimacy came not from power, but from their relationship with the spirit world and the accuracy of their visions. The earliest of these prophets appeared before the migration westward. His teachings became the first fire, warning the people that they must leave their original homeland and follow a long trail. He described signs that would mark the way, one of which, the sacred food menumen, guided them to the Great Lakes centuries later. This prophet spoke in metaphors and symbols, yet his predictions became literal history. But the prophets who came after him, the ones who predicted the arrival of Europeans, were even more astonishing. According to oral history, one prophet described a light-skinned race with faces like the rising sun, arriving on floating islands whose tops would be white like foam. This was long before anyone in the region had seen a ship larger than a canoe. Another prophet saw that these newcomers would carry thunder sticks and shining plates on their bodies. Another foresaw the diseases that would sweep through the land, describing them as great winds of sickness that no medicine can stop. Still another spoke of roads made of iron snakes crossing the land, centuries before railroads existed. These visions did not come from imagination alone. To the Anishinaabe, prophetic sight was not a supernatural anomaly. It was a gift, a skill cultivated through ceremony, dreams, and deep relationship with the spiritual realm. The Midwewin, the Grand Medicine Society, taught advanced forms of spiritual awareness. Through fasting, isolation, prayer, and ceremonial practice, individuals could receive visions with profound clarity. Whether these visions came from ancestors, the creator, or the spirit world was a matter of interpretation, but their accuracy was not. European missionaries and explorers were among the first outsiders to record these encounters with prophets. Jesuit priests in the 1600s wrote in their journals with astonishment about indigenous leaders who seemed to know of their arrival long before contact. One Jesuit account describes an elder explaining the appearance of pale men from across the Great Salt Water as something their people had awaited for generations. Another missionary wrote that he felt as though the indigenous nations held a book of prophecy we could not see. These accounts, though filtered through colonial biases, confirm something remarkable. The prophets were not simply inventing metaphors. They were predicting real events. Yet the most extraordinary part was not what they predicted, but how. Many elders explain that prophecy is not about seeing a predetermined future. It is about seeing patterns, movements of human behavior, cycles of nature, the consequences that follow certain choices. When people forget their responsibilities to the land, disaster follows. When greed overtakes balance, conflict emerges. When cultures clash violently, suffering spreads. These are not supernatural predictions but deep understandings of human nature and natural law. But there is also something more, something that science struggles to explain. Some prophets described visions that appear almost technological. They spoke of roads made of iron, flying objects, and giant cities where the air itself grew sick. They spoke of a time when the earth would be covered in a thin layer of dust, a haunting echo of modern climate change. They described networks of paths crossing the land in all directions, which some elders interpret today as highways. How could they have known? Some suggest the prophets accessed knowledge through altered states of consciousness during ceremony, states that modern neuroscience only recently began to study. Others believe they received messages through dreams from ancestors or beings not bound by linear time. Still others argue that the oral stories have been shaped by hindsight, becoming more precise as generations retrofitted interpretations. But these explanations fall short of dismissing the prophecy's uncanny accuracy. Many details cannot be explained away so easily. For example, long before Europeans arrived, one prophet warned that the newcomers would bring not just weapons but a way of life that would cause the land itself to suffer. He described a time when the rivers will run dark, and the tall trees will fall without honor. These are exact reflections of industrial pollution and deforestation, events unimaginable in pre-contact times. Another prophet described a time when people would lose their connection to the earth and walk with empty eyes, searching for meaning. This eerily describes modern spiritual disconnection, depression, and the anxiety-driven culture of consumerism. For scholars studying the prophecy, the question isn't simply whether the prophets predicted the future, it's how they understood the world in ways we are only now beginning to recognize. One theory suggests the prophets were master observers of nature and human behavior, able to see long-term consequences with astonishing clarity. Another theory proposes that indigenous cultural memory, passed meticulously through oral tradition, held insights from ancient civilizations that modern society has forgotten. Still others believe the prophets accessed a form of knowledge that is beyond conventional scientific explanation. Within Anishinaabe communities, the answer is simpler. The prophets saw because they were meant to see. Their purpose was to guide the people, and their words were gifts from the spirit world. These teachings were not about predicting doom but preparing people for choices. They were a warning wrapped in hope, a reminder that every generation has the power to shape the future. The prophets were not fortune-tellers. They were guardians of wisdom, sent to help humanity avoid catastrophe. Yet for all their insight, the prophets also spoke of a final truth. They could see only so far. Beyond the seventh fire, the path blurred. The eighth fire, if it came, was a possibility, not a certainty. It depended on the decisions of people who were not yet born, living in a world the prophets could barely describe. That world is the one we now inhabit. As humanity stands at the crossroads the prophets warned of, Their teachings echo louder than ever. Their visions are no longer distant stories. They are the daily headlines. Their warnings are not abstract. They are the crises we now face. And their message continues to resonate, calling us back to balance, to memory, to unity. The prophets saw the future. Now it is our turn to decide whether their warnings lead to destruction, or whether their wisdom helps ignite the eighth fire. For generations, the seven fires prophecy has been treated with reverence, mystery, and awe. But as the events it foretold began to unfold with uncanny precision, people, indigenous and non-indigenous alike, started asking deeper questions. How could ancient prophets have predicted migrations, the arrival of Europeans, ecological collapse, and even the spiritual crisis of the modern world? Were these visions supernatural, symbolic, intuitive, or rooted in a kind of knowledge that contemporary society had forgotten how to understand? To explore the prophecy's origins, scholars, elders, linguists, and spiritual leaders have put forward a range of theories. None of them fully explain the prophecy by themselves, yet each offers a piece of a puzzle stretching across history, consciousness, and culture. One theory centers on the idea of cultural memory, the notion that deep-time knowledge is stored within stories and passed down through generations. In this view, the prophecy isn't a miraculous forecast of the future, but a distillation of patterns observed over thousands of years. The Anishinaabe and related nations lived in close connection with ecological cycles, human migrations, and political changes long before written history. They witnessed how rising populations, shifting climates, or foreign contacts affected societies globally. Their oral histories stretch further back than most modern timelines acknowledge. Through careful observation and storytelling, they understood that world-changing events often follow recognizable patterns. New arrivals disrupt old societies, greed leads to imbalance, and communities flourish when they maintain reciprocity with the land. To the modern mind, this may not sound like prophecy. But indigenous worldviews treat memory not as a linear archive, but as a circle that connects past, present, and future. In this sense, prophecy grows from ancestral wisdom, knowledge so old it appears timeless. Another theory looks to neuroscience and psychology. Many indigenous ceremonies involve practices, fasting, isolation, rhythmic drumming, extended prayer, dream incubation, that can induce altered states of consciousness. In these states, the brain processes information differently. Insights may emerge that connect disparate observations, revealing truths that are difficult to see in ordinary awareness. Scientists studying trance, intuition, and dreams have found that the human mind is capable of drawing conclusions and recognizing patterns far ahead of conscious reasoning. Some elders say visions are a way of seeing beyond time, but even within scientific frameworks, intuition and dreams can reveal future possibilities by synthesizing information the conscious mind has not yet articulated. But the depth of the seven fires goes far beyond intuitive foresight. The specificity of its predictions, floating islands, thunder sticks, iron roads, dying waters, pushes scholars to consider more complex possibilities. One perspective suggests that the prophecy formed through spiritual communication, through ancestors, spirits, or beings from what the Anishinaabe call the spirit world. This is not metaphorical within indigenous belief systems. The spirit world is as real as the physical one, a place where knowledge flows freely without the limits of linear time. Many elders say that visionaries access teachings from outside the human timeline, receiving glimpses of events that had not yet occurred. In this worldview, prophecy is not prediction but message. The prophets were not guessing, they were being shown. A related interpretation frames time itself differently. Western societies see time as linear, past behind, future ahead, present in between. But in many indigenous traditions, time is cyclical and layered. Events echo each other. The future is a returning, not a departure. What has happened before will happen again, unless corrected. In this cyclical framework, the prophets were not forecasting a distant unknown. They were recognizing the return of old patterns in new forms. Colonization, environmental decline, cultural clash. These are cycles humanity has seen before, in other eras and other places. Still, these explanations only illuminate part of the mystery. Linguists studying indigenous languages point out something extraordinary. Many indigenous languages encode relationships in ways that English cannot. They describe actions rather than objects, responsibilities rather than ownership, interdependence rather than separation. A phrase in Anishinaabe might describe the land as a living being, or a river as something that teaches. In such a worldview, hearing messages from the land is not mystical, it's simply listening. A prophet who heard the earth crying may have literally perceived environmental stress signals long before they became visible. This framework opens another theory: ecological foresight. The Anishinaabe were expert environmental observers. Their knowledge of the land extended over centuries of close observation. They could read subtle shifts in animal behavior, plant growth, water quality, and seasonal patterns. Even small disruptions signaled future consequences. When modern scientists study climate change, they often find that their newest models reflect knowledge indigenous nations have carried for generations. What scientists call data, indigenous nations call teachings. What scientists call feedback loops, indigenous nations call relationships. But even this does not fully explain the prophecy's depth or timing. Some scholars speculate that ancient migrations brought the Anishinaabe into contact with cultures from distant regions, perhaps even indirectly with civilizations that had knowledge of early oceanic travel or far-ranging trade. They wonder if stories of light-skinned people from the East may have filtered through older global exchanges, transformed through oral tradition into prophetic imagery. But this theory feels insufficient. The prophecy's details are too unique, too rooted in spiritual frameworks rather than geopolitical ones. Then there are theories at the edges of mainstream thought. Some propose that prophecy might arise through collective unconscious, the idea that humanity shares a pool of symbolic knowledge. Others suggest quantum explanations, that consciousness interacts with time in ways not yet understood. A few even theorize that ancient cultures possessed ways of knowing that modern science has not yet rediscovered, forms of perception, intuition, or spiritual attunement that have been lost in a world governed by materialism. Within Anishinaabe teachings, none of this is necessary. The explanation is simple. The prophets saw because they were meant to see. Their visions were gifts, responsibilities, burdens. They did not claim ownership of their knowledge. They carried it for the people. But perhaps the most important understanding, the one shared by elders and many scholars, is that prophecy is not about predicting a fixed future. It is about warning humanity of possibilities. The Seven Fires prophecy is a map, not of what must happen, but of what could happen depending on human behavior. It describes consequences, choices, cycles, and potential futures. It does not claim inevitability. It offers guidance. Prophecy in this sense is less about supernatural foresight and more about an ethical, relational intelligence. It is moral vision. It is wisdom applied over 7 generations. It is the ability to see the direction humanity is walking and to warn what lies at the end of that path. And yet, even with all these theories, one truth remains. None of them fully explain the prophecy. Not cultural memory, not spiritual communication, not ecological foresight, not psychological intuition, not symbolic interpretation, not speculative theories at the edge of science. The prophecy remains, at its core, a mystery, one that refuses to be confined by a single worldview. It exists at the intersection of spirit, story, memory, and time. It belongs to no discipline, yet challenges every one of them. What it asks of us is not to decipher how it came to be, but to understand what it means. Because the 7th fire is here, the choices are ours. And the possibility of the 8th fire depends not on solving the mystery of the prophecy's origin, but on choosing the path it implores us to walk. They gather now in spaces that did not exist when the prophecy was first spoken: urban apartments, suburban kitchens, digital classrooms, community centers, university lecture halls, Zoom calls, social media circles, art studios, activist camps, and round dance flash mobs in shopping malls. Yet despite these modern forms, the energy they carry is ancient. It is the same flame that once flickered in the lodges of the Midwewin, the same spark protected by the secret keepers during the darkest days of the 5th fire. It lives now in the hearts of the 7th generation youth, a generation unlike any before it, shaped by the fractures of the modern world, but still hearing the echo of the old ones calling them home. This generation is the bridge between worlds. They grow up surrounded by technology, phones, screens, satellites, algorithms. They navigate systems built by colonization while struggling to reclaim teachings nearly stolen from them. Many were raised far from their ancestral lands, in cities where concrete covers the earth and the stars are hidden by buildings. Many learned English before their ancestral languages, Christianity before ceremony, and textbooks before oral history. They inherited trauma passed down through generations, poverty, displacement, residential school wounds, addictions, intergenerational fear, and the silence that often follows survival. And yet, something in them refuses to remain silent. They feel a pull they cannot always explain, a longing for identity, belonging, meaning, and connection, a hunger to know the stories that were taken, a need to stand up for a world that feels increasingly fragile. They are searching for something deeper than the noise of modern life, something older, steadier, truer. This is the seventh generation awakening. Some rediscover their heritage through language classes, learning Anishinaabe one word at a time. The first time they say buzhu or miigwech out loud, their voices might shake, but something ancient stirs in their chest. Others learn from TikTok educators or YouTube videos created by indigenous content creators, digital firesides where teachings are shared freely, reaching people across vast distances. Still others reconnect by returning physically to the land, attending ceremonies, planting medicines, learning to fish and hunt, sitting with elders who speak slowly so the youth can absorb every syllable. Some discover their cultural identity through activism, learning who they are by defending what their ancestors protected. They travel to pipeline blockades, join marches for missing and murdered indigenous women, organize cleanup efforts on polluted rivers, or fight for treaty rights in courtrooms and legislative halls. Through struggle, they meet others on the same journey, forming bonds that resemble the old clan networks, relationships built not just on friendship but responsibility. Others reconnect gently, quietly, privately. A young woman beads her first pair of earrings, feeling her hands move as though guided by generations before her. A young man sits by the water and speaks his fears aloud, knowing the lake is listening. A child born in the city dances for the first time at a powwow, her regalia shimmering like an echo of her ancestors' pride. A teenager lights sage in a bedroom, whispering a prayer no one taught them, and yet somehow they know the words. Each of these moments is a spark. Each spark contributes to the growing flame of the seventh fire. The strength of this generation comes not from perfection, but from resilience. They are learning to carry both the heaviness of intergenerational trauma and the lightness of ancestral hope. They navigate complicated identities, urban and reserve, modern and traditional, indigenous and mixed, fluent and learning, rooted and searching. They are not one thing. They are many things held together by a resilient thread of memory. The modern world, with all its complexity, provides tools that the ancestors could not have imagined. Social media becomes a platform for reclaiming teachings. Podcasts become modern storytelling circles. Online archives preserve languages once threatened with extinction. Digital art carries ancient symbols into the future. Activists livestream from the front lines, transforming local struggles into global movements in real time. Elders see this and recognize that the prophecy is unfolding exactly as it was meant to. The seventh generation, the prophecy said, would be the ones to return to the knowledge left along the trail. These young people are doing just that, picking up pieces of teaching scattered by colonization and holding them like fragments of a sacred vessel that must be rebuilt, piece by piece, with patience and love. Elders describe this generation as the turning generation, the ones who will decide whether humanity walks the good path or the broken one. The weight of that responsibility is immense. Many youth feel overwhelmed by the crises they inherited: climate change, inequality, homelessness, systemic racism, mental health struggles, and the ongoing legacy of colonization. Some feel lost or disconnected, their spirits burdened by a world out of balance. And yet, even within that struggle, there is strength. The youth share openly about their pain, breaking cycles of silence. They support one another across nations and borders. They build communities rooted in love and accountability. They challenge government systems, corporate greed, and environmental destruction. They create music, poetry, films, and art that speak of healing, survival, resurgence. These expressions are the modern form of prophecy, visions spoken through creativity, community, and courage. Some elders say that the seventh generation was chosen long before birth, that their spirits volunteered to come into a time of great chaos to help guide humanity toward the eighth fire, that they carry ancient memories inside them, waiting to be awakened. Others say the seventh generation is the first in centuries to live without the direct suppression of ceremony. Residential schools have closed. Indigenous languages are being revitalized. Laws that once banned spiritual practices have been abolished. This generation has the freedom to reclaim what was nearly lost. The elders see in their eyes the possibility of global transformation. For many non-Indigenous people, the awakening of the seventh generation serves as a call to reflection, an invitation to examine their own relationship with the land, with community, with responsibility. Some become allies in environmental movements, treaty defense, language revitalization, and cultural restoration. Others begin questioning the systems of extraction and dominance they grew up believing were normal. In the prophecy, the seventh generation is not limited to Indigenous youth alone. It includes all young people who choose to walk the good path. This unity across cultures is one of the clearest signs that the eighth fire is possible. The elders teach that if the youth of all nations, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, come together in respect and truth, the world can shift toward harmony. The eighth fire, they say, will be lit when humanity remembers that we belong to the earth, not the other way around. The seventh generation stands now at the edge of that possibility. They carry the dreams of their ancestors and the hopes of the children yet to come. They have endured hardship, rediscovered identity, and embraced responsibility. They are the ones who must choose the path forward, and already they are lighting the way. The world watches them, some with fear, others with admiration, many with hope, because the flame they carry is fragile, but it is also powerful. It is the flame that survived the darkest centuries. It is the flame that the prophets trusted would guide humanity home. And as their voices rise, singing, marching, praying, resisting, remembering, one thing becomes clear. The seventh generation is not just awakening. It is preparing the world for what comes next. For the moment when humanity must decide whether the eighth fire will ignite or fade into darkness before it ever has the chance to burn. The late era of the seventh fire is a time when the world feels stretched between collapse and awakening, as if humanity is holding its breath while standing at the edge of two possible futures. Climate disasters intensify, reshaping coastlines, forests, and cities with a force that cannot be ignored. Fires burn uncontrollably, storms grow stronger, and ecosystems strain under centuries of imbalance. Scientists warn of thresholds and elders warn of spiritual consequences, yet both voices speak to the same truth. The earth cannot carry humanity's burdens much longer. As environmental pressures rise, social tensions deepen. Nations argue over resources. Communities face division, fueled by fear, misinformation, and political agendas. Some cling to old systems built on extraction and dominance, refusing to acknowledge their failures. Others fight for renewal, pushing toward a world that honors balance and justice. This conflict is not abstract. It plays out in households, workplaces, and streets. The seventh fire makes clear that humanity must choose one path or the other. Amid this turmoil, something extraordinary emerges. Unlikely alliances form across cultures and generations. Scientists collaborate with elders. Activists join with farmers. Youth movements rise, uniting people around shared responsibility for water, land, and future generations. The revival of ceremony strengthens communities, grounding people in practices that nurture humility and connection. This era becomes a mirror, reflecting not only humanity's mistakes but also its potential. People begin to realize that survival depends not on domination, but cooperation, not on hoarding, but reciprocity. The seventh fire tests whether humanity can listen, truly listen, to the earth, to each other, and to the warnings carried through generations. The prophecy says that clarity comes after the greatest turmoil. And as the world trembles, the path toward the eighth fire begins to reveal itself. Not guaranteed, but possible, depending on the choices made now. As humanity moves deeper into the trials of the seventh fire, the earth begins speaking in ways more urgent than ever before. Fires scorch regions once thought safe, floods swallow entire communities, and winds howl with unnatural strength. These events are not random. They are messages from a world pushed beyond its limits. Elders say the land is crying out, reminding humanity that the original agreements have been broken. Scientists echo the same warnings through data and charts, yet the essence remains identical. A relationship once sacred has been deeply damaged. People feel the shift not only in the environment but within themselves. Dreams become vivid, intuition heightens, and many sense a spiritual presence urging them to pay attention. Some describe feeling guided, as if ancestors are whispering reminders long forgotten. Others experience a growing unease, a realization that humanity stands at a crossroads with consequences reaching far into the future. Across communities, new alliances form. Activists, scholars, knowledge keepers, and youth gather in circles, both physical and digital, to imagine a different world. Ceremony becomes a center of healing, reminding people that solutions require not only policy, but spirit. The world begins to witness a return to humility, a willingness to learn from those who never forgot their responsibilities to the land. Yet resistance remains strong. Industries cling to profit. Governments struggle to balance short-term interests with long-term survival. Many fear the changes necessary for renewal. This tension defines the era, a struggle between preservation of a broken system and creation of a balanced one. The prophecy teaches that the seventh fire reveals humanity's deepest challenge, to choose whether to continue down a destructive path or to restore the sacred relationship with the earth. The eighth fire glows faintly ahead, waiting for the moment when enough hearts commit to walking the good path. The seventh fire leaves humanity standing at the threshold of a decision larger than any before it. The prophecy does not end with destruction or salvation, but with a choice carried in the hearts of people living today. After centuries of movement, loss, revival, and awakening, everything converges into this moment of reflection. The eighth fire flickers like a faint glow on the horizon, waiting to see whether humanity will walk toward it or turn away. The ancestors cannot choose for us. They can only guide. The future depends on what we do now. In this era, people begin to understand that prophecy is not rigid fate but living instruction. The meaning shifts as the world changes, revealing layers once hidden. The message is simple. If humanity honors the land, respects each other, and restores balance, a new era of peace can be born. But if greed, extraction, and division continue, the fire ahead will be dark, and its consequences irreversible. This final threshold is not shaped only by nations or leaders, but by the quiet decisions individuals make daily, how they treat water, how they see the land, how they care for the vulnerable. The world is not saved through grand gestures alone, but through millions of small acts that accumulate like sparks joining a flame. People begin recognizing that they belong to the earth, not the other way around. The prophecy ends by offering a possibility, not a promise. It reminds humanity that wisdom is not found in dominance but in relationship, not in consumption but in reciprocity. The eighth fire waits patiently, knowing it cannot ignite without human intention. It asks each person the same question. Will you walk with humility, courage, and truth? The answer determines everything that comes next. As the world approaches the edge of profound transformation, the teachings of the prophecy echo with new clarity. The future is not inherited, it is shaped. In this emerging era, people begin to rebuild relationships that were neglected for generations. The land becomes more than a backdrop. It becomes a teacher again. Water becomes more than a resource. It becomes a responsibility. Children learn that every action carries consequence, and every decision shapes the world they will inherit. Communities shift their focus from extraction to restoration. They plant trees where forests were stripped away. They clean rivers long polluted. They honor treaties once dismissed. Indigenous languages return to classrooms, spoken proudly by children whose ancestors were punished for speaking them. Elders, once silenced, become essential guides. Technology, instead of working against nature, begins to work with it, healing damage rather than causing more. This transition is not perfect, nor is it easy. Some resist change. Old systems cling to power. But the momentum of the world begins to tilt toward balance. Young people push for justice. Families reconnect with traditions. Nations recognize that cooperation is not weakness but strength. Even in the face of uncertainty, a quiet hope grows, an understanding that healing is possible. The path toward the eighth fire requires humility. It demands acknowledgement of past harms and dedication to repair. It requires listening not just to people but to the earth, the water, and the ancestors. Through this listening, humanity begins to understand that harmony is not an ideal. It is a practice repeated every day. The eighth fire rises not from grand declarations, but from consistent commitment. It ignites when enough people choose respect, responsibility, and relationship. And in this choice, the world begins to see a new horizon, one shaped not by fear, but by intention, balance, and hope. In the final steps of the prophecy's long journey, the question becomes personal. What role will each person play in the world that comes next? The seven fires have shown how choices ripple through generations. They have shown how destruction can follow disconnection, and how renewal can rise from memory. Now, the responsibility rests with humanity to decide what legacy will be left for the children of tomorrow. The eighth fire is not merely a prophecy. It is an opportunity, a chance for humanity to build a world rooted in balance rather than exploitation, in respect rather than domination, in relationship rather than separation. It invites each person to become a firekeeper, tending a flame that holds the future. This flame is fragile yet powerful. It burns through truth, healing, and action. The future will be shaped not only by governments or leaders, but by the everyday choices of individuals. Every moment matters. Choosing to protect water, choosing to speak with kindness, choosing to honor ancestors, choosing to repair harm, choosing to restore land, choosing to listen. These decisions accumulate like embers that feed a growing fire. The prophecy ends not with certainty, but possibility. It offers a path forward, a path that requires courage to face truth, humility to change, and love to protect what is sacred. It asks humanity to walk gently, to think ahead, to care deeply, and to understand that we are responsible not only for ourselves, but for generations yet unborn. As the final fire waits on the horizon, glowing softly like dawn, the message becomes clear. The future is not fixed. It is shaped by hands willing to tend the flame. The eighth fire can burn brightly, lighting a world of peace and unity, but only if we choose to ignite it.